Hey there, I'm Ryan. Welcome to today's acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description. And if you'd like help with the drawing process, I will have the traceable up over on Patreon along with the reference photo for color matching. With that said, this channel is predominantly community funded, so if you feel like you're enjoying, you're having fun, you're learning things, do consider checking out the Patreon. Up there we do have a lot of fun stuff on top of the traceables and reference photos, like that of access to the polls, my collection of ebooks, our private Facebook group, bonus lessons, and a lot more. So a bunch of fun stuff up there. Do check it out if you're interested. But with that, let's jump into it and have some fun. We're going to begin here today on a 9 by 12 inch canvas and with a 1 inch flat-headed brush. I'm going to dip the bottom third of this into a little bit of water, and that's going to condense the bristles. It's going to allow my paint to stay wet for a longer period of time. But with that, let's jump into step number 1. So we'll start by taking quite a lot of titanium white and moving that to a new spot on our palette. We'll grab about 1/10 that in Mars Black because it's quite a strong pigment, and about 1/10 that in our Ultramarine blue as well, taking off the excess if you accidentally grab too much. Then we'll mix up something quite bright but a little bit desaturated, a little bit cool because of the blue, and this is essentially going to be the pigment for our sky. It is very bright. In the reference photo, we have a lot of light coming through there, but we still want it to have a little bit of a hue. That way it, matches with the rest of the painting. And we also want to ensure here that it isn't a pure white, so that it isn't incredibly stark, so that it doesn't kind of overshadow all of the other highlights that we have going on in the painting. Now, as you can see, I start predominantly by working with horizontal strokes, but then I will move into X-shaped patterns, and I do this so that I can move the paint not only horizontally but vertically as well, and then I smooth it all by just going back and forth with those horizontal strokes. That way, if there are any brush strokes that are hyper noticeable that we render with this pattern, we can smooth it all out. And with that, I'm going to go back, grab a little bit more of our water, mix up a little bit more of our mixture. That way I'm not just kind of spreading out what paint we already have. Generally when that happens, we end up with thin layers, and we don't want that. So, here we go, just continuing. And I know we are going over all of the trees. Often something I get comments about, why draw them on if we're just going to cover them up and then have to redraw them. It's great practice. It allows us to figure out very quickly where we want everything to be. And if we don't end up liking something, then in the second iteration, once we have this background painted, we can simply go back and change it. So it just gives us some practice. It allows us to visually see what we're going to do before we really commit to it by drawing over the paint. And it's just a generally good step. With that, here we go one more time, just because, again, we really don't want to scrape this paint around, revealing portions of the canvas underneath. Really does look a lot more professional when you have thick layers. So here, we'll just go back in. And if you're wondering how I'm still blending with all of this, it's simply because the brush is relatively damp, and the water in the bristles is keeping the paint wet for a longer period of time. So here I'm able to move all the way back up to the top. None of it's dried. It's starting to, but I still have a little bit of time. And with that, I'm now going to let this fully dry. Going to apply a second layer, just to, again, ensure it's nice and thick. I can tell it's a little bit thin right there, a little bit thin right there. And then we'll come back in with the drawing. But you know what? I say that just so we don't miss anything or forget to do it later. Let's actually take this opportunity to grab a little bit more of that paint, and we'll apply it over here in little splotches. That way when we paint this larger, very thick tree later on, we have these openings very organically that we can just kind of paint around. And again, we'll do 2 layers of this as well. I don't have to be too concerned about making it perfectly horizontal or consistent because it's something that's very designated to a singular area. You won't really be able to see the brush strokes through the foliage later on, but it's good practice. And with that, again, I'm going to let it dry, go back and paint a second layer, then we will continue together. Now we're going to switch to a 1/2 inch flat-headed brush so we can get some extra detail. So we're going to start by working on the foliage that we have right here on the back of the painting. It's essentially the brightest, it's the most desaturated, and that's because all of the light is working its way through it. However, it's a little difficult to distinguish what's, farthest away. So in Photoshop, I made a bit of a simplified version. So here you can see it just kind of amalgamated a lot of the little details so that we get this very definitive hue, but we're working on everything that you can see there, and we'll slowly move forward, adding more color and contrast to it. But to mix this right here, we are going to use our flat-headed brush, grab quite a bit of our titanium white, grab about 2/10 Mars Black, so double what we used in our previous mixture, and then we'll also go ahead and we'll grab some sap green. Now again, this will be about maybe 1/10 just to begin, because we really don't want to overdo it. And here you can see just how strong that pigment is. Much more saturated than what we have over here, and it's a bit darker. So we can add some titanium white. This is going to brighten it as we need to, but it's also going to be good because it's going to desaturate it. Titanium white and Mars Black both take away from the hue's vibrance. So we can test that. It's very close. I think it could be a little bit darker and a little bit more gray. Mars Black will do both of those things. So we add a hint. And we'll give that a try. That is actually perfect. Really, really like it. So now we'll head back over to the canvas. Yes, Howie. So now we're going to head back over to the canvas, pick up a little bit of that pigment, and I'm going to begin very simply by working on the trunks of the trees, which generally, you'd think of as a bit more of a brown, maybe a gray, certainly not a green. However, we have a lot of reflective light moving around through here. We're going to have a lot of foliage covering them, and we also want this pigment to be very cohesive in the background so that it doesn't kind of overshadow everything that we do in the foreground. So we're going to start here with these distant trees. And I like to do a lot of the trunks via tapping motion, as you can see. I think a lot of people like to apply it and then drag down, but often that gives you a very smooth looking, almost a natural application, where trees generally have a lot of intricate little movements, a lot of different unique pieces that they're amalgamated by, and that's because, they grow, they're affected by wildlife, by wind, by weather. There's so many different things that have an impact, and it's important that we remember to incorporate those. That way we get something that does look nice and natural. So I do go in with all of these little taps. I do try to connect it fairly well, but I'll also occasionally just have a little piece that kind of intentionally sticks out and makes the subject a bit more captivating. Now, here, I have a bit of a wider subject, a bit of a wider tree, so I'm applying more pressure with my brush. Generally, the more pressure you apply, the more the bristles will expand, and the larger the application you have. So with these smaller ones, I'm applying as little pressure as I possibly can so that I get that small, very subtle application. And we'll do that right here as well. But when you get to the larger ones, like this, you can see that I'm applying more pressure. There's a bit more of a drag in the brush. Just like so. And then smaller ones, again, lighter tap. So we're just kind of bouncing back and forth. You can also see how this tree has all of these winds in it. This one is a bit more straight, but none of them are actually straight. And that's important. Trees will almost always have a bit of a bend, if not multiple in them, because they have branches, foliage, all of these different things weighing different areas down, and they grow with those areas being weighted. So it's important to remember. Things are going to look a little awkward for a bit though. Just be aware that is generally how working with acrylics work. Have to do all of our layering to make it look natural. There we go. But we'll just finish up this one right here, and then we'll move until another brush to do all of our foliage, which will happen now. So from here, we'll be switching to a fairly soft fan brush, and this is fantastic because when it has paint on it, these start to clump together a little bit, but you can do, through a tapping motion, a myriad of applications, rendering just so much foliage very, very quickly. So something like this is an incredible resource when working on greenery. With that, let's jump into a demo. So now we can take that fan brush and some of our newly mixed pigment. We'll head down in here, and through a series of taps, you can see that we create just so many little applications. I'm rotating my brush very frequently. That way our applications are always different. If we were to essentially just tap with the same orientation, watch what happens. You see how we end up with these lines rather than all of these interesting little pieces? So here, I'm just going to fix that by going back, adding that more randomized element to it. And we're starting right down here on the bottom because it's a great area to test in. There's a lot of foliage at the base, and so this is an area where we can kind of fill in to a great extent. And if your first applications don't look extremely professional, that's okay, because we're just going to block in a lot of it, cover up a lot of it, condense a lot of it. It's when we get higher up and when things get more sparse that we need to be a little bit better with the technique. So here, again, making things sparse, we'll have some areas of the tree that are a little bit more thin, and then they'll get more thick foliage, and then they'll get more thin again. Creating diversity is really what's going to make this as interesting as it can be. Here, again, we'll take a little bit of a break from that foliage. We're not going to have branches reaching out to all of these because it just wouldn't look that natural. Sometimes branches in the distance are just small to the point where you can't really see or recognize them in real life. And it's one of those strange things where, like, maybe it should be in the painting, we think to add it, but it ends up looking a little overcomplicated and unnatural when or if we do. So here, we're going in, especially in the background, with less of the branches, and as we continue to move forward, we'll slowly instigate more of them. Now here, I've had quite a bit of practice at that bottom, feeling fairly confident, so I start to move up in the painting. Again, rotating my brush. Though I think it's worth noting that I'm not rotating my brush here when I'm making contact with the canvas. That exclusively happens when the brush is in the air, because if you rotate the brush while you are on the canvas, then you'll end up creating strokes, and we don't want that. We want taps. But you can see just how quickly these all start to come to be. Really, really efficient process. And we'll do more of this in the midground and foreground, but we are going to change up the technique a little bit. That way we get more detail and continue to make it look natural. It's always important to remember that the background is going to visually look more ambiguous, and the closer you get to the foreground, the more detail you get, the more realistic you start to paint it. Because again, in the background, the eye just can't pick up that much detail, and it's realistic to not include what you would see if you were close up to the subject. I hope that all makes sense. With that, here we go, starting to look quite nice. You can tell that I'm really trying to randomize it. Different clusters, shapes, amounts. I really don't want two trees ever looking the same. And this is another area where we are going to get to cover the majority of the bottom, so I'll just kind of block off the top there, grab more pigment, head back in. And if you want to really fill in this bottom area a bit more quickly, You can apply more pressure with your brush. It'll expand the bristles. You'll get larger applications every time, right? Like we talked about previously with the flat-headed brush. But when you get higher up in the tree and you really want to focus on the detail, then you go in with the softer taps, and you can see that these markings are a lot smaller than what we have down here. So it's really just figuring out what you want to accomplish, where you want to accomplish it, and you can do the smaller applications like this down here as well. Just recognize that it'll take a little bit longer because they just won't take up as much space. But there's nothing wrong with taking time with your piece. When I started the channel, I had a series called 10-minute paintings, which you may or may not be familiar with, but it was just this fun idea, this challenge of, can I make a tiny painting in 10 minutes? And some weeks it worked, some weeks it didn't. I think that it was a great exercise though, just to try different colors, different compositions, different subjects, right? But I really want to articulate the fact that you don't ever have to paint quickly, and your painting isn't better if you finished it in less time than someone else or your past painting. Do take the time if it needs it, if you're having fun. Nothing wrong with putting 10 hours into a painting, 50 hours into a painting, 100 hours into the painting. As long as you're having fun, you're learning things, then that's great. So with that, I'm just going to finish up applying these, maybe mix a little bit more paint, and then we'll jump into the next step. But this is essentially just all we needed to do here, because we don't want to make it overly complicated so that our midground and our foreground don't just make it look too much visually. We want some space, some opening, and I like what we have. Now we're going to start working on the second layer of foliage that we have in here. It's a little bit darker than what we have at the top. You can see it a little bit there, you can see it there, right through here. And again, to try to make things a little bit easier, I did print this off, and you can see it notably there. It's not the darkest green that we have in here, it's not the highest contrast, but it's very much in the middle, and that's what we're going to work on rendering next. Though we're going to, instead of just going for a singular color, build it up over a couple of applications. So I'm going to go for the mid value that we have in here. Not the brightest, not the darkest, but very much the middle. So we'll grab some of our sap green, and this is just about dry, so I don't mind working on top of it. We'll grab some Mars black, quite a bit of titanium white, and this should be darker than this mixture, which is why I did want to keep it on my palette just so I have a bit of a reference. I also want it to be a little bit more saturated. Generally, when we move forward in the painting, we get more of the innate coloring of subjects, so they get a bit more vibrant, and they get more saturated, they get more, again, just more of a contrast. So we'll try that. I think that's quite close to the middle, but I think it could be a little bit, just a little bit brighter. Add some titanium white, maybe a little bit of green. This is a brighter pigment than what we're currently mixing, so it will brighten it, while also adding a bit of saturation. I think I like that a lot. Okay, let's give this a try. Head back over to the canvas. So once we have quite a bit of that pigment mixed up on our palette, we're going to go back to our fan brush, and using that same technique, we're going to tap in some of this darker pigment, again, in the areas that I initially noted on the reference photo, but we don't want to cover everything that we've already applied. I really like when you can build up multiple layers and therefore show more depth. We don't have any gradients going on just yet, but you can tell that there are multiple areas in this piece, that there are different spaces that one could explore, and that it doesn't look flat, and we're getting that effect because we now have multiple values. We have this lighter value in the background, we have this more middle value in the foreground, and it's all going to build up. We'll apply more to this in a little bit, and we'll also apply a foreground layer which add a third section of foliage and again another layer of depth, and we're just slowly moving in that direction. You can see that I'm skipping some spots. And I didn't start with the tree trunks. I really just wanted to get a feel for the amount of foliage we need, and then I figured I'd go back in and we just kind of connect everything through tree trunks where necessary. And we're going to want to do a lot of this, or at least more so of it, closer to this ground area, because this is essentially where you get a lot less light, and so it's naturally just going to be a little bit darker even if the foliage is slightly farther away. If you allow the paint to run out as you move up, you can also get a little bit of a natural gradient, because the brush won't have as much paint, but it'll still have a bit of water. It'll thin the paint, and then you'll get it progressively getting brighter as you move up, which makes sense because it gets brighter because there are less other pieces of foliage and things to cast shadows. So that's something we can work with just to build on it. Again, will look a little messy for the first half of this piece, but once we get all of the layers in, it'll look natural, it'll look realistic, it'll look very detailed. But I note that I think in the last step and this one as well, because often I know when we're just starting painting, we want those instant results. You want that gratification immediately. But with acrylics, often it's not towards the second half where things really start coming together, because you're just doing so much layering because the paint is thin. But again, that's a good thing because it means it's forgiving. You just let it dry for 10 minutes, you come back, you paint over it, and you try again. So you really don't have to worry about messing up with the medium because it's so easy to fix. But it does mean that we do have to put more time into the layers and just kind of trust the process, trust that you will get there. Don't worry if it looks a little messy. Don't worry if it doesn't look perfect just yet. It's not meant to, but if you stick with it, you will get there. And today, we'll get there together. So I'm just going to tap these in, and we'll move to our next step. So now that we've implemented the mid value through these sections, we want the darker texture details that we have in there, and they're not going to be hyper dark. They're not going to be as dark as what we have here in the foreground, but it'll be one step below that. So we'll grab some of our Mars Black and we'll just mix it again over top what we were doing previously. It started to dry, but I do want to compare it directly to this to know that we're doing the right thing. Now, I'm going with something initially fairly close to what we just had, and you can tell that I'm progressively just making it brighter and brighter, adding more and more titanium white. I'll add a bit more of this because its pigment is, again, brighter. And there, it's very far from like a Mars Black, and we'll just take the extra off there, but it's certainly darker than this, and I think that will add a really nice kind of speckled effect, which we can layer more highlights on top of. So I'll mix up a bit more of this, and then we'll switch to a different brush for the application. So I'll be switching to another 1/2 inch flat-headed brush just like this. Here we have the original one. It's more of a medium to soft. This one, it's a bit more stiff, and that means we can peel back the bristles. This is going to be very useful because we'll be going in with a tapping effect, and all of these individual little stray pieces is going to render a different little bit of shadowy texture. So just look for an older flat-headed brush or something that is a bit more stiff. Doesn't even have to be a flat-headed brush, but just something that gives you a bunch of these little strays, and that'll do great for this next step. So now we'll take that brush, and we're not going to press too hard into our palette. We're just going to grab a little bit of the paint, fairly soft. We want it on the ends of our bristles. We don't want it kind of moving up them though, because then it'll start to condense them. We want these still as far apart as we can. And now we'll go into the darker areas of foliage, like this. And we'll just do the same tapping motion that we were doing with the fan brush. However, it's a bit more targeted now. You get these smaller little textures. It's very subtle. And if you find it's too subtle, you can always go back and make your pigment a bit darker. But I think I actually really like this. I wanted something subtle, We aren't in the foreground yet. That is where the real contrast is going to come in. And if you kind of stray out of the initial applications here, because that will happen, the fan brush doesn't render that large of an application. That is okay, it's just going to look like an even smaller piece of stray foliage, and that isn't a bad thing aesthetically. So we're just working all of this in, going back, grabbing quite a bit, and at this point I've essentially run out of pigment on there, so we'll just grab the other brush. And I wanted to show you this part of the process because it's important that we don't mix with the other one, with the one that we're making the actual applications with, because when you mix paint, it condenses all of your bristles. The paint, it moves it all together, and we don't want that. We again want those to remain as far apart as they can be. So I'll go back in and I'll redo my mix with the more soft to medium flat-headed brush. And it doesn't have to be a perfect mix, but again, you want it to be fairly close to the original. I think what we got there was pretty great. Go back, grab more. There we go. So far, so good. Once this is done, we can go create a bit of a highlight and add that on top. Again, just building our layers. Though we didn't do any of this with the very first one, because again, it was farther away and we just weren't going to see this level of detail in the shadows. But with that, quite happy. Do one more application and we'll head to the next application. The next step. The next series of steps. Yeah, that does look good though. Okay. So now we're going to head back in, and if you look very closely in these more mid-value to darker areas, you can still see little speckles of highlight, and that's what we're going to work on next. So this needs to be brighter than what we have here as the initial middle value. So I'm going to begin by grabbing some titanium white, and I'll work off to the left-hand side since that's a bit darker. We'll grab maybe about 2/5 sap green, grab about 2/5 Mars black just to start things off, see where that gets us. And it's much brighter than what we had, but I think it's, if anything, closest to what we have in the very background. And we want things to get progressively more saturated. So we'll add in more of our green. I think that's too bright. We'll save, that level of brightness for the true foreground. I'll add in more Mars black. And I think that looks really nice compared to what we have. But again, could be slightly brighter. Go in for a little bit of a test. Yeah, I think that's a really nice highlight for just a couple of spots amongst our latest application. So I'll mix up a bit more, or at least just spread out what we have. Then we'll switch back to the fan brush. So heading back in, we have our fan brush. We'll grab a little bit of this highlight. And then we're initially going to want to place this more so around the tops of this darker area, because the light's hypothetically coming down. The top is the first area that the light is going to hit, and then it'll probably dissipate as we move in and down. So I work on those areas that are closest to the light, and then I'll start to work in as soon as we run out of paint on the brush. That way it gets more and more subtle as we move farther down. We get this very natural gradient of light. And we don't want to overdo it. We do want a lot of those darker pigments to show through. It's that contrast that's going to make it look three-dimensional and natural. So definitely begin with the less is more attitude. It's a lot easier to go in and add more than it is to go in and take away. Though if you do accidentally add too much, don't worry about it. All you have to do is let that paint dry. Come back in 10 minutes later with the darker pigment. Layer that on top of the brighter pigment, let that dry, and then you can go back to working on the lighter areas. That is one of the big benefits of acrylic paint. It's just so forgiving. If something doesn't work out the first time, that's a-okay. We have an opportunity to fix it, to learn from it, and that's why I really love this medium. I'm one of those people who really appreciates the ability to go back and change things. Maybe I get a new idea, maybe I want to change the composition, maybe I want to rebalance the values of the hues, maybe I want to change a color. Acrylics just makes all of that so easy. Don't have to worry about any of it. You just let it dry, come back, make it the way you want it to be. So here, just finishing up. Not going to do too much more. Again, don't want to overdo it, and I do want a lot of this to show through. But starting to look pretty nice. And again, this is only the midground. The real detail, as well as the real contrast, is yet to come. We're also missing just a lot of form in here, which we will interject quite quickly. But with that, on to our next step, and a brand new brush. Now we are going to switch to a new brush, but first I am going to go back to the 1/2 inch flat-headed brush just to do a little bit of mixing. And here I'm going to be creating a pigment which is just slightly darker and slightly less saturated than what we have here. We'll still be using some green in it, but we want to work on the trunks of our trees, which again I think a lot of us naturally think of as a brown, a gray. However, we are going to have a lot of green light kind of reflecting off of our foliage. So, because it's in the distance, something like this is going to be ideal. I'll just test it, make sure it looks cohesive. It does. Okay, so now we'll jump into a different brush. Now here we have a liner brush, and it's incredibly tiny. When it's wet, all of these will condense together and we'll be able to render an incredibly small application, which is exactly what we want for our midground to background branches, trunks, all of that good stuff. So with that, let's dip it in a little bit of water, wipe off the excess, and grab some paint. So now we'll grab some of that pigment and we'll just weave some branches, some tree trunks in between our foliage using a very small amount of pressure, having them connect here and there. I'm again going to apply some and then have it get lost in some foliage, have it kind of stick out and then come back in, have it move on top. We really want a wide variety of movements through here, and that's what's going to make the most interesting piece. If you go for a longer line, do remember to, unlike what I just did, craft it through a series of taps and drags rather than just a singular longer line. And you can tell that as you run out of paint it gets a bit more transparent, which is also great, because it makes it look like it's getting farther away. So we're just creating some branches to connect a lot of our loose foliage. Nothing too tricky. Just ensure that you're not kind of following the same pattern every time, that it's always evolving, that you have something continuously engaging. Because you don't want the viewer to look at the painting and then feel like they immediately understand all of the patterns, how it's working, because then it becomes disinteresting much more quickly. And in nature, while there are patterns, while everything is, consisting of patterns, we're going to have a lot more ambiguity in how things move, and that's what's going to make it look natural, realistic, and again, engaging for a longer period of time. So here we're just creating bunch of these little motions. Though I am taking the less is more approach, which is why you see me jumping around so much. I'm not really heavily doubling down on one area or another, because we can always go back and add more if we feel we need more. And having a little bit of time to digest what we did is often quite beneficial. We also don't want too much detail because we are going to be going back later with the foreground subjects, and again, that's where the real detail happens. This is something that we see behind the true foreground. And again, we can always go back to that more later. So, I think I'm actually very, very happy with how much we have. Don't want to overdo it. And with that, we'll move into the next step. Now we're going to start working on the mid values for the trees that we have in the foreground. You can see it on the left hand, the right hand, and a little bit in the middle. It'll also be right around the bottom. Now I want quite a bit of paint, so I've moved back to the 1-inch flat-headed brush just because it allows me to mix a whole lot more, and we're going to be mixing the mid value that we can see in there. Again, not the darkest, not the bright highlights either, just something nice in the middle. And we're going to start by grabbing quite a bit of our sap green. Everything on the palette has dried, so I'm not too worried about that. And we'll grab about 1/3 that in Mars black. Mix those two up. And already we have a really, really beautiful color. Though I do want to brighten it, and I'm going to brighten it with more green. I'm opting to do this over the titanium white because the titanium white's really going to desaturate it because we have so much Mars black in it. So I'm trying to avoid using this and this in conjunction. We'll have to use a little bit, but this is brighter than our current mixture, so I know I can continue to brighten it with that green. Now, I feel like we do need to grab a little bit of this. I'm going to be very sparing, take off the excess. You can already tell that the saturation is starting to leave it a little bit, but I think it's looking really, really pretty. Go in for a couple of tests just right around the painting. I think that is a great middle value. Again, not the brightest pigment, not the darkest pigment. Perfectly balanced. So I'll mix up a bit more of this, and then together we'll go in and we'll start applying the base layer to the foreground foliage. Now we're going to switch back to that fan brush that we've been using, grab some of our pigment, and we'll start working right here over on the left hand side, tapping in all of these little applications. We left quite a lot of open canvas, so we'll have to apply that fairly thick. And you know what you can also do? Where is that brush? You can also take that 1-inch brush and just apply that right over all of the open areas. And we'll fix the edging with the fan brush. But this will just ensure that we don't have any canvas showing through at the very end, and that it looks nice and professional. You might also want to go through and do a couple of layers just to ensure that it's nice and thick, like what we did for the background, as I did go back in and do a second layer, which did have a big impact on the aesthetic. So, now that we've done that, switch back to that fan brush. We'll go down here to the bottom. And really have a lot of fun just tapping this around. Going to work quite a bit around these edges. Fill in a lot of these openings because they really weren't meant to be this big initially. But I just wanted a lot of opportunity, and this is exactly what I'm being given. Because now I can kind of fill in the open spaces however I'd like. Again, it will look a little awkward in the beginning because it is going to be relatively thin, because we're going to have darker values through here, and because it's our most saturated pigment. But we will be able to balance it out with a couple more layers, so don't worry about that. There we go. I think we need to mix more paint, so we'll grab quite a lot of that sap green, Mars black, more sap green to brighten it up. Again, we'll go in with the titanium white only at the end when we have to. There we are. Nice, thick, and consistent. So, we'll grab that. And now we'll head over to the right-hand side. Start applying all of these. I'm not really going to let my brush run out of pigment like I did previously, because when they get semi-transparent, you can really see just how vibrant and yellow the green is. And I don't want that for a non-highlight. This is really meant to be that mid-value. So we're going to go over areas a couple of times, make them nice and thick. Really cover both of the edges, creating a bit of a framing effect. Continuously dancing around with our brush. Moving it over in towards the bottom as well, as we do. I think it's really adding a lot of life though. The extra vibrant pigment, I like it a lot. Okay, so far so good. Just took a couple of steps back there. Friendly reminder, by the way, often when we paint, we get really up close to the piece and we can kind of focus in too much on very minute details that make an area look great, but make it not fit in with anything else. So make sure that you are consistently taking 5 or 6 steps back. You hear this in every lesson, but it's good advice. Take those steps back, look at the painting, make sure that it's progressing well together and that things are balanced, that you're not adding too much or too little detail in one area or another. Does make an impact. And again, often when you look at a painting, it isn't from half a foot away, it's from many feet away, right? Especially when you walk into a room and see a piece for the first time. You have to walk up to it to see that detail. The first impression is made at quite a distance. So we'll just continue that. I think I'll have some of our foreground foliage right here. I can see it in the reference photo. So it's predominantly along the edges, and then we also have some in the middle. That said, see if that's dry. Not quite dry. I'm going to let all of it dry, and then I'll go back in and I'll do a second layer there and there. The reason I'm not doing it now is because it's a little watery. If I were to add paint to it, it might be difficult. It might not connect in the way that I want. So we're just going to let it dry 5 minutes, go back in, finish up this layer, and then you can move on to the next one. Okay, so it's been about 10 minutes and things are just about dry to the touch. So I'm going to go back in initially with the 1-inch flat-headed brush and just work over all of the larger areas, trying to avoid any of the smaller openings. I'm doing this just because it's much easier to kind of get all of that paint on there in the specific spots that we want it than it would be with a fan brush, as it does have a bit more of a randomized application, but you can really tell just how much darker all of this looks upon the second application, because it's not as transparent now. Instead of seeing that light blue sky behind, you do see more of this green, and it's much more thick. I admittedly am not using much water in this mixture, simply so that I can get something that's very, very strong. Though admittedly I did just put my brush in the water again. That way I can ensure that I can continue doing this. It's one of those things where it's all about balance, finding that right amount. After you do this for quite some time, it does get to be intuitive, but it's a bit of trial and error, at least initially. So there we're just continuing on. I use the corner of the brush to create all of the little individual pieces that we normally would create with the fan brush. And you can go back in with the fan brush. It's something I will do, but I just want to make sure that the edges are relatively organic before I get to that, just because at that point I am kind of relinquishing some of my control, right? And here we have the opportunity to really make those edges look nice. So just doing little taps around our past applications, filling that out a little bit more. Though because I'm choosing to fill it out more, I have to ensure that I go in with really thick paint because it'll only have a singular layer. Again, easier because my brush is now more dry than it was upon the initial application, but still something to consider. Okay, I think the majority of this at this point will need the fan brush, just because me continuously tapping it is going to eventually build up a specific pattern that I don't want. I want it to be more randomized, so it looks more natural. So I'm going to move over to another area of the canvas, fill that in a bit more, grab even more paint. Again, we did a lot of the body here, but we didn't really do the edges. Almost put my brush back into the water, then caught myself at the last second. Don't want to do that right now. If I find that I'm no longer getting the very sharp applications, the correct call is just to grab more paint, not more water. Normally, it's both, but if you want your application to be really thick, like I do here, you are going to avoid that water. There we go. That's nice. We have two good framed pieces on either side. Okay. Now we'll mix up a bit more paint. Quite a bit of green, quite a bit of black. Remember, this time we're really avoiding that titanium white until the very end. And then we're not even using that much. So we'll drop that brush, grab our fan brush, we'll make it damp but not wet. And this is where we reinstigate all of those details that just didn't pop to the same extent because they were a little bit too thin. And we're ensuring that none of the applications that we just did that rendered hard edges are still noticeable. We just want organic, ever-changing edging throughout all of this. There we go. It's pretty neat. Like the idea of it kind of coming up here, going back down through there. It's different. You can still see some of the branches showing through it, which I like. Really feels like a natural progression. Feels open, but there's a lot going on. Like I said, we just need to add those layers and it'll all start making sense. That said, this is still just the base layer of our foreground subjects, and this too will look a lot better in just a minute. That said, I'm going to take 3 steps back. It's looking really good. Awesome. Okay. I'll just touch up this because I realized that it looked a little blocky from a distance. Didn't realize it up close, but again, that's why we take those steps back. See if it looks less blocky now. It does. Okay. Now we are going to let this dry, head back over to our mixing station, and we'll start working on the darker textured layer that goes on top of it right before our highlight. But this does need to be dry first. That way we're not blending, and that way we get that really nice sharp texture that we want to see in the foreground. So now we're going to head back and find the darkest pigments that we have along the edges at the bottom for the texture. Now I'm going to start with quite a bit of Mars Black. We'll grab probably an equal mixture of our Sap Green. We'll grab just a hint of the Titanium White because I really don't want to brighten this up much, but I do want to desaturate it just a hint. And as you can see, I'm mixing right on top of our previous mixture That way I know it'll look quite good and create a nice shadow for it. Now, I've gone back and I've added Mars Black twice, and I think this actually looks like a really great color for those shadows. So, with that, let's switch to one of our 1/2 inch flat-headed brushes and peel back those bristles a little bit. That way we get the nice little texture. Now let's head over to the canvas. So, heading over to the canvas, again, we're going to try to get a minimal amount of paint on the end of these bristles, that way it doesn't kind of clump them together. But once we have that, we'll go into these larger clusters initially and start this tapping process. You can tell that it is quite a bit darker, but we are going to leave openings. That way we still see that really nice, vibrant, mid-value green showing through. And like all of our other applications, we are going to rotate the brush in the air to ensure that it's nice and diverse. That said, I think what we should probably do is get you a little bit closer, that way you can really see all of these detailed little applications. Now we're jumping into the middle-ish of the painting. And you can see, go for a little tap, a little rotate, little tap, little rotate. Going to be careful as we get up here, so I'm only using the edge of the brush, that way I don't kind of expand this farther than I'd like. And you don't want to go over an area too many times, because then you can kind of fill it in and lose all of those nice greens that we have behind. So, if you find that going about this in a quick manner, which is something I think a lot of us will naturally do just because it's very cathartic tapping that on, recognize that we can take it a little bit slower, and that means you only have to go over an area once because you've applied it all relatively methodically. Then you'll be in a great position for the next step here. So here you can see I am taking my time. I'm looking at what areas actually need more rather than just kind of loosely tapping. There we go. So far so good. And now I think we'll head over to the right-hand side. Get you a little bit farther away though, that way you can see what it all looks like together and the larger visual context. It's starting to look like a pretty dramatic edge. However, once we start adding the highlights back over a lot of this, it'll feel much more cohesive rather than a frame. So don't worry too much about that. I think that this has a lot of potential. Just do a couple more taps right up here. Starting to run out of paint. Turns out we mixed, seems to be the perfect amount. Have to love when that turns out. Okay, now we are going to let that dry and mix our next pigment. Now that we have our darker texture implemented, we're going to start creating the lightest pigment. So we're going to start with some of our green, some of our titanium white, little bit of Mars Black, and we've already established a relatively light green for the mid-value. You can kind of see it right here on the palette, still there. So I want something essentially that bright, but a little bit more saturated. So I'm going to use less Mars Black than I typically would. And I think this right here is a really beautiful color. It's not too saturated. It's not too bright. We can try a little bit more. This would be the absolute most though. And then I'll try that along some of these edges. I like that a lot. I think that's a great color. Yeah, okay, back to the palette. Well, canvas. Okay, so now we're back. We have our fan brush. We'll grab that nice, beautiful highlight. And I'll start working this initially around our edges because again, that's where the light's going to be coming in. We're going to have it working through and around, illuminating different protruding pieces of foliage, clusters of foliage. So we really want this edge to be where that light does begin. But then we can start working our way inwards. And we can have little patches that stick out of these larger clusters and therefore receive light because they're extended. They can catch more light despite the fact that they are a bit farther back. And then we're also applying some of these highlights right around the openings that we have. And we do have a plentiful amount of those. I'm doing a couple on the right hand side of them, but predominantly it's going to be on the left hand side. Because again, that's generally the way the light is moving. So, we'll just work that around there. Have it come down. There will be less highlight as you move farther down though. Because again, there's just going to be more shadow being cast down here. So I do become a little bit more loose with it. Start to apply less. Where up here, it's abundant and it's much more methodical. Really trying to ensure that we follow those general rules and that it's noticeable. Here we'll just work on an area that protrudes and sticks out. You can do that through here as well. Just because we have a fairly large darker area. And I do want it to continuously look like it's evolving. And if it's just a large patch of that darker texture, it's not really going to be that visually captivating, right? Very quickly we will kind of discern all of the different movements, patterns, and just kind of move on. And that's not the goal. Here we go, working on this little one. Just using one little point of the fan brush here because I don't want to commit too many in that very small, subtle spot. Here we have an opportunity to create some really beautiful highlights. Working it predominantly on the top here, however, might do a little bit at the bottom because if the light's coming down, it will catch the other side and we'll see that, but we want it for the most part moving down the edge that we can really see. There we go. Really starting to look a whole lot better. I like this a lot. So that stage of the painting we've been waiting for. So here, now, again, the sides that are closest to the light. Let's say the light's in the middle. So, comes this way, illuminates the left-hand side, or rather the right-hand side of the subjects on the left-hand side of the painting. And then over on the right-hand side of the painting, it illuminates the subject's left-hand side, if that makes any sense. So just essentially the opposite to the side of the painting that it's on. And then here in the middle, it's more so the top. There we are. And it is honestly just so much fun. I love this part of the process. One of those things I wish I was working on a 24 by 36 inch canvas for. That way I could just keep doing it for hours on end. Really, really cathartic. Getting a little bit more loose here, simply because I'm not painting on the right hand side of the canvas where it would be a little bit easier. But we'll still try to get that good detail in and try to ensure that we have some form, that it's wrapping around naturally. Still taking little breaks from using the entirety of the brush and just use a little corner to tap in some more intentional details. There we go. And now we might come over here. We're going to take a couple of steps back, just make sure it's balanced. Yeah, that's wonderful. Okay, very, very happy. Now we can go in with an even brighter mixture and really build up the highlights, and I might do that a little bit later in the painting. But before that, I want to do more of it, more so the bottom. That way I can tell if we can justify adding it to the top, or if adding it up there will essentially make it overshadow everything that we do down below, which we don't want. So there is definitely an extra layer we could add to the top, but I don't know that it would be smart to, and we won't know that until we do the bottom. So with that, we are going to move on to the next step. Okay, so now we're going to start working on some of the more prevalent tree trunks that we have there, and I've added some burnt umber here to my palette. This is going to give us a nice earthy look, so we'll grab some of that. I'll move it over into the darker greens. These have all fully dried, but it'll give me a good idea of what it'll look like with the other colors that we have in the painting. Then I'll grab some Mars Black, about an equal amount, and we'll grab the smallest amount of titanium white to desaturate some of that burnt umber. This rendering a very nice dark mix. We will go back and add highlights to it, but I think that's pretty perfect and just what I want for now. So let's head over to the painting. Now we'll be switching back to the smaller liner brush because we do want to work on the smaller details. We'll grab some of that paint, and now I'll look on the reference photo just for the most prominent pieces. I'm going to have this weaving in and out of a lot of our foliage, and as I move farther down, I'll expand my applications, my pressure a little bit as well. That way the amount of paint that leaves the brush is more. You can see that we'll move over a lot of this foliage, but then there's an opening in the foliage, and I think it's at that point that we can kind of let it get lost behind everything else. And then we have an opening down here so it can re-emerge. And that right there is really the type of movement we're looking for. Though, let's make it a bit more interesting. Let's have a branch kind of come out of it, like that. We'll have other little pieces out here. I'm also going to create another large one that's going to come down in a similar spot. You can tell that all of their trajectories are a little bit different, and none of them are perfectly straight like we talked about previously. We'll head over to this side now, and I think we'll put one right here around the center. Again, looking at the reference photo, but also making my own changes and decisions. Reference photos are there to aid you, to guide you, but not really to handcuff you to an idea or two. And the same goes for this tutorial, by the way. I want to offer you ideas, and I want to show you my techniques, how I would go about it, but I'd also welcome you to make changes, approach it and pieces of it in ways that you'd like, make it your own, and really just have fun with it. You don't have to do exactly what I'm doing, and I don't want you to ever have to feel that way. Art can be so individual, so personal, and you are more than welcome to make those alterations and just have fun with the process. As I'm doing right now. Here I'm working a lot of it in between foliage. There we go. Nice to have some larger, sturdy looking pieces. Again, we'll do another one. And I think that'll probably be all of the larger ones on the left and the right hand side. Though, note I did 1, 2, 3, 4 larger pieces on the left side, and I did 1, 2, arguably 3 on this side. That is purposefully different. That way they are, unique in their own right? Now I'll also go ahead and do some smaller ones down here. I have more water on my brush, so they're more transparent. so that I can get a softer application. And I'm working this into the background, as you can see. There we are. It's a really nice, subtle look. But it's also not even close to as dark as what we had over here because of all of the water on the brush. And if you find your applications here are quite dark, then I'd recommend either adding a lot of titanium white to your mixture to the point where it's about the same value as this green, or again, just add water as I did until it's thin to the point where it's almost transparent. And therefore, a lot brighter, because the background which we're painting it on is brighter itself. There we go. Just having some fun moving around. Now there are a couple rather large moving pieces through here, and one of them I can tell moves up and then it goes in that way, and then it moves up again, and that's hypothetically this one. So what I'm going to do is create a larger application right down here at the bottom, nice and dark, and then I'll have it weave this way in here, and then I'll just have it get lost, and then it'll just stop, and that'll hypothetically be this larger one that we have in the distance. And I think I'll continue what we have here, maybe connect it, give it a neat offshoot like that, and that can move up into the midground. So also moving back, but not to as great of a degree. And now we have elements, subjects, which are moving us, the viewer, from our middle ground into, or rather our foreground into our middle ground and then to our background. Again, really, really doubling down on the amount of depth we have here. Might be a little bit more quiet through this portion just because it's one of those things that does require some concentration. Don't want to overdo it. These are quite stark when I don't have an overabundance of water, and therefore are quite visually notable and require a good amount of attention. Okay, grab a bit more. Have it move up through there. Yeah, I like that. Now that we're starting to work with the smaller ones, and I definitely recommend starting with smaller applications all throughout, and then gradually making them larger, because as we've talked about with other subjects, it's so much easier to make your subjects larger than it is to make them smaller. Going back and adding another fairly large one to this side because I felt like we had added enough elsewhere to justify it to the point where it wouldn't look overbearing. And if you find you add too many of these, a very easy fix is to just go back in and add more foliage later on. It's not something I feel like I'll have to do at this point, but I know it is an option if I do accidentally kind of go overboard. Definitely want more of the smaller ones at this point. There we go, that's a nice application. Very different, very unique. I'm going to grab a lot of water. There we go. Have a couple branches kind of reaching from one side to the other, kind of closing this gap a little bit. It's different. And it's starting to look organically messy. That's the term I want to go with. Because if you look at a reference photo of nature and you try to do every application, it's probably going to look messy. But the goal is to make it look intentionally messy and naturally messy. And I think that's just about where we're at. Yeah. Really, really happy. Let's connect this through this and then back into this. You can see that I have some little waves in there. You can do some offshoots. Make it neat. There we go. Okay. With that, I think we can move on to the next step. Now we're going to start working on some of the warmer earthy browns that we have throughout the trees. This is going to be very subtle. We're not going to do a lot of it, but it will look nice and it will add some depth to the trees we just rendered. So we'll grab some of our burnt umber. We'll grab a little bit of titanium white. Just a hint of Mars black this time. And we'll mix it right beside our previous mixture. Go in with a test. I think that works quite well for that. But what I really want is the highlight on the side of this tree. So we'll try another mixture with double the amount of titanium white. And I think that looks quite nice. So we're going to go in with both of these and just start to add a little bit more to our previously rendered tree trunks. Now, heading back into this, it's important to consider yet again where that light is coming from. If it's coming from the middle, then the right-hand side of our left-hand side's trees are going to have the highlight, and the left-hand side of the trees on the right-hand side are going to have the highlight. Again, I know, a little convoluted to say, but here's a little demo. We're going to the left-hand side of these trees and just doing a little series of taps, building up this light, allowing that darker area to still show through on the other side. And clean that brush, grab a little bit more. Now we'll head over here and we'll apply this to the right hand side, so the opposite. Just like that. I'm going to predominantly do this in the areas where there's a light coming through. So we have a patch of light there, we have a patch of light there. And I'll have it kind of dissipate in the middle because this area is blocked off. And I'll also save this predominantly for the larger tree trunks and branches. Because when we go over it, we'll probably expand a little bit. Not intentionally, but just because we'll be trying to stay over the black, or almost black, but not fully. And so we'll probably push our brush a little bit more to the other side. It'll expand. And again, we want to keep these relatively small. Now I'm getting more of the real highlight. This particular piece is very much out in the open, receiving quite a lot of light. So we really did a lot there. We'll head over here slowly. We'll be more selective with where we apply it. Again, let it just kind of run out as we get around the light, just like that. I think that looks quite nice. Keeping it all fairly subtle. Heading over to this side again with that nice light. And then we can also work this in the middle. And if that's coming down, we'll have it kind of cradled in between these two. And up over on this side. I'm doing a lot of dragging, by the way. That isn't intentional. It's still ideal to go in with multiple taps as I'm currently doing. Little tap and drag effects rather than a singular stroke. There we go. It's looking quite nice. Again, every layer builds it up, makes it something special. Work that down. Work that down. Really lovely. Okay, and again, I don't want to overdo it because I want to ensure that the bottom balances it properly. So I think this is probably where we'll stop for now, but we may come back to it a little bit later in the painting. With that, we are going to now work on the much larger, rocky, mossy foliage area down around the waterfall. Now for our next step, we're going to start working on the base layer for all of this land that we have right here. And as you can see, it is extremely dark, arguably the darkest subject that we've had thus far, with the exception of maybe the darkest darks in the foreground trees. So we're going to start by taking quite a lot of Mars Black, and I do mean a lot. We'll move that over here on our palette. We'll grab about 2/10 that Ultramarine Blue, 1/10 that Titanium White, and we'll mix up a cool, very dark gray. Go in for a test. I think that looks fantastic. So now we're essentially going to block off this entire area with pigment. Then we'll go back in, do the moss, foliage. I guess we'll probably work around the waterfall, but that's it. Now we do have quite a lot to cover here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by mapping out where the waterfall is. That way I know not to cover it with this pigment. We'll just go to right there, and then there are a couple openings in the waterfall where you can see the rock. So there's one right there. There's a bit of a larger one right through here. You can see that they all have a bit of a trajectory moving this way. And this will all be slightly exposed rock through all of that falling water. It'll be a really neat technique. And then we'll find the other edge of the waterfall right here. We'll find the base of the rock right where it meets the water at the bottom. There's a little bit of a curvature to it. And you can see that I am going with a singular stroke here rather than multiple little strokes, because unlike the trees, this is something that can be a bit more soft looking. And now we'll go up to the top of our waterfall, craft the larger rock, and then where it changes into moss and foliage. Over on this side, we also have a fairly dramatic slope, a little bit of a bump, like that. And then we get quite a lot of foliage up here, and I'll just make it a little bit bumpy, that way we can kind of designate different plants for that spot. Then we head back down. The waterfall probably ends right there. And starts to taper. So wider at the bottom, gets smaller at the top. And now we can just have fun and fill it all in. Again, I know that we have a lot of foliage and things drawn in here. You don't have to do all of that drawing when we, initially start the painting, but again, I really like to because it lets me familiarize myself with the subjects, with the sizing, with what we're going to be doing, and again, if I want to change anything, right? It's a lot easier to do that when you're drawing on canvas that you know you're going to cover up than drawing on finished paint, right? So, again, big fan of doing that drawing twice, once before and once after. It's also worth noting that if you kind of forget where things are, you can always go back to the start of the lesson. And if you support the channel up over on Patreon, you can also get the reference photos as well as traceables. And there are a bunch of different traceable options, some with grids, some without, some with the reference photo kind of showing through. I try to give you a lot of option that way. If you have a preference, you can work with it. I know I often use a couple of them, just kind of use what I need in different areas. But with that, we are moving over to the other side. You can see we're really getting a lot of surface area. A good, nice thick coat. My brush is damp, but it's not overly damp. I'm really just using a lot of paint right now. And this is something that you'll probably want to do 2 layers of. So you'll just let it dry. And then we'll come back and do it one more time. Like we did with the sky. That way we know we have a really professional thick application. I say this in every lesson, but it's just in case somebody is entirely new to this channel. Generally, when people are new to painting, more so kind of in that initial range, they tend to apply paint and then they scrape it to cover everything, right? And then you get these thin areas and you can kind of see the canvas through it, and it just doesn't have a professional look. And you can tell when somebody's been painting for quite some time because the paint is really on there, their base layers are nice and thick, that canvas is nowhere to be seen unless it's very intentional, and you can generally tell when it's very intentional. But do go ahead and apply those thick layers once you know where you want them. It will make the painting look a whole lot better. Here I'm just going to fill in that area because it was a little bit thin from me doing that demonstration. Though, I will still need to go back and do a second application over just about all of this. So, I'm going to let this dry, wait 5 to 10 minutes, do a second layer, and then we'll jump into the next step together. Now, at the base of our rock here, I think it's quite evident that we have a bit of a desaturated blue that almost is applied through quite a bit of a speckle. That way we have a lot of texture in the rock, but then you can also see it's divided by some line work. Now, I think the best way of going about this is to go in with all the texture and then work the form in afterwards. So, we're going to grab some of our ultramarine blue. Everything's dry on the palette at this point, so it doesn't really matter where we put it. I'll do that right here just so it's nice and visible. But once we have that, we'll grab a little bit of our titanium white, not too much. And then we'll grab about an equal mixture of Mars black that we grabbed in titanium white. And this should desaturate the blue. Bring it down to be something relatively dark. We'll go in with a test. And I like it. I think that'll work for portions, but it's certainly not bright enough for all of them. So we'll take more of this mixture, we'll just move that off to the side. Grab more titanium white. Mix that together nice and thoroughly. That way we don't have some areas that are quite white and others that are a bit more black. And we want a nice mix, and that right there is a really nice color. I think with just a hint of Mars black it'll be perfect. Taking off the excess as we do. Yeah, okay, so these are the 2 pigments that we'll be going in with, and we'll be doing so with, again, that 1/2" flat-headed brush, which is fairly disheveled. So I'll just rough it up a little bit, and we'll head into the painting. So the texture We're going to start with the darker pigment, and it's most prominent down towards the bottom. That's really where it's notable. We have more moss sitting at the top and a lot of foliage as well. So I'm just going to begin right down here with this tapping motion, again rotating my brush, same way we did with our foliage. And it's kind of amazing just how you can take one technique and move it from subject to subject with small alterations. The real alteration here is going to be what we do in the next layer to separate different portions of this rock and make it look really natural, like it's in sheets. It's a really, really fun technique. One of my favorites. I always love painting rock, and I think this is definitely one of the better ways to paint very textured rock like what we have down here. So we'll just tap all of that on, and we'll move it up in the painting. We're going to cover just about all of this with foliage, so you won't really see it, but if there is an area where it's kind of exposed, then this will be a nice little added technique. Go back in, do a secondary pass in the more notable areas. Let it just kind of run out as we move up higher and higher. And I'll get you a little bit closer for the highlight. So now we're going to switch over to the brighter application that we mixed. And I'm going to be fairly careful with this. I don't want too much of it, but I know that I need some right beside the waterfall. So I'm actually going to do this on top of the open white spot of the canvas. That way it really does get that edge and it doesn't look like the highlight just stops right before the water. There we go. And then we can kind of continue outwards a little bit. It'll get darker as we get towards the very bottom, just because there'll probably be a bit of a lip with the rock. And it'll get darker as we move up because we'll start to move into that foliage and there'll be more shadows. But this is the more open, exposed portion of the rock, and therefore it's going to get the brightest, most prominent applications. There we go, nice and easy. We'll grab the dark pigment, work that in between our waterfall here, make sure that that texture is not forgotten in the smaller spots. There we are. And we'll grab a little bit of the highlight for that too, though I don't want to do too much because I really want the highlighted water to pop. So we just need enough that it makes sense within the context of the other side. There we go. Okay, now we'll head on over to the left. Yet again, we are beginning right at the bottom and right beside the waterfall. Going in for a really grand amount of taps, leaving some random little open areas. Doesn't have to be hyper consistent. Having those little abnormalities will make the piece more interesting long term. And again, we'll just have it really dissipate as we move up into the areas that we know are going to be foliage heavy. Come back, make sure I get that bottom. You don't want to do too many layers though, much like with the trees, because if you do, you can kind of lose the darker base that's shown through each of the bristles, and then you end up losing your contrast. So do be careful with that. Now we'll grab some of that highlight, work it along the edge, inwards. Really beautiful. Great texture. And again, it'll look much more rock-like in just a couple minutes when we also work in all of the little separated areas that note that it is sheets of rock. Different broken up portions. We'll also grab some of this, and while there's going to be a lot of moss at the top, there's also going to be some exposed rock. So I'll just do that same technique up here, predominantly where that light's coming down to hit it. And here, they can actually connect, which is a nice look. It's also worth noting that I'd rather go a little bit too far in than not far enough in. So we can always cover this with more foliage, but if we don't paint an area, we are forced to put foliage there, where if we have the rock, we have more option. So I'm extending this in much more than I think I'll need to. Grab a bit more of that highlight, work that up towards the top, add that nice rock texture. There we go. Okay. With that, I think we'll just do a little bit more of a highlight on this side. And then, when this is done, we'll move into that next step. Now, when we look into this area very specifically, you can see a larger kind of crevice, this opening in the rock right there. You can see one that moves across right there. You can see these little lines breaking apart different portions, again making it look like it's all of these little slate pieces, and that's really what we're going to be going for. So we need to start by mixing a color, and that's very simply going to be the darker base layer that we already had. So we have that on our palette. We know exactly what to mix to. We need a lot of Mars black, a little bit of our ultramarine blue, a little bit of titanium white, and this should do just great. Yeah, okay, so we'll head into the canvas with that. However, we will be switching to our small liner brush, as we do want a lot of fine detail work. So we're going in with a very damp liner brush, that incredibly dark pigment, and I'm going to start by looking for the largest movements and separations in the rock. The first one is going to be moving down on a similar angle as the waterfall, so that's just something we can look at for an easy reference. It's a series of breaks and cracks, so I'll expand upon that one larger one off on both sides, and then I can also have it break apart in stages after skipping little pieces. Then we also have a piece, or rather an opening, that separates this top and this bottom area. So we'll make sure we make that nice and distinct. And then it too has little openings, and I can tell right now I don't have enough water on my brush. I have too much paint, so it's difficult to get those sharp applications. So I just took that paint off of my brush, grabbed some more water, and this is much, much better. Very easy fix once you recognize what's going on there. And I'm making this a little bit bigger as I go, as I work on the other pieces and realize, you know what? We can rescale a little bit. Grab a bit more. Break this off into little portions and sections. It's all fairly subtle, but that's how it's meant to be. And if you just keep doing this, all of a sudden you'll look back at your painting and you'll say, hey, that's a bunch of rocks. It's a nice thing. It's a very nice thing. There we go. Try to make sure that your separations differ in size. And you can also go in and just do little taps, little different details to make it unique, interesting. There we are. We'll head up a bit more. I like that quite a lot. Yeah. Especially when we get foliage around here. It will be great. I'm going to create another larger crevice similar to that one. And then I'll make an underside of our rock right here by just adding some darker pigment like that, and then I blend downwards. It's very watery, so it's an easy blend. And that just makes it look like the rock comes down and then it goes back in, and this area can't receive any light. Therefore, we also don't have to paint any more detail in it because that detail is only formed when you have that contrast. There we go. I don't really want to overdo this area, so I think we're probably going to call it after this application, and we'll move over onto the other side. Yeah, I like that. Okay, over here. Now this side's a little bit different in that we don't have as many little breaks, at least not in the reference photo, so I may opt to add those in myself, but there is another piece that moves inwards. So we'll get our pigment. We'll work along this edge here. You can see that we've crafted this fairly unique looking line. I'm going to make my brush fairly wet, and then I'm going to start blending in and down. That way it looks like the rock moves inwards, and then after a little bit you can start to see that detail again because there isn't as much of a shadow from the indent. There we go. Definitely a unique piece. Then there's another break that happens this way. And I think I'm going to use this as an excuse to do lots of little breaks like we did on the other side. Again, not present in the reference photo, but something I visually very much appreciate and think is fun. It's much more simple in the reference photo, but you can take these artistic liberties and break up your rocks how you'd like to. There we are. Grab a little bit more. I'm finding all of these organic movements just because of how we tapped all of the texture on. And they're kind of giving me these roadways to work with. Very natural way of going about it. Not really trying to force everything, just going with what's already there, what's already kind of presented itself. There we go. Okay, now we'll start heading up. As I noted previously, this area is going to get pretty mossy, so we don't have to do much, but I do want to show where the rock kind of has these halts and then dips back down, has this little shelf effect. And one area is right here and it moves in this V pattern. So we'll just break that up, grab a bit more paint, do a couple of applications. We have another little piece right here. So now we have some good separation. You'll notice that this and this are different sizes. Something we are constantly working towards. We'll have another little dip in the rock there. And I think I might create some interesting little patterns that are just naturally, again, presenting themselves. And we can go back and do this again once we have our moss. You can also cover up any of these with moss if you feel like you've overdone it, or you just don't really like how a particular area looks. So that's nice. You can do the same with foliage throughout this too. Again, really forgiving medium in a really forgiving area. I'm also now just going in doing some little darker taps to build even more texture. I really like that. I think it looks great. So with that, we are going to move on to our next step. Now that we have all of our rock applied, we're going to start working on the moss that we have right up here and the moss that we have right down there. Much like everything else, it's done with two different passes. One, the base layer, darker, and then the highlights on top. So we'll start with the base layer, as we tend to do. I'll grab some Mars Black, about an equal mixture of sap green, I think. I don't want it to be too dark. We do need it to be brighter than the actual shadows that we have in there. And then we'll grab about maybe 1/5 that titanium white. Now this doesn't look all that dark, it doesn't look all that bright, which means it's probably fairly close to what we actually want. Yeah, I like that right there. And I like that at the bottom as well. Okay, excellent. Really nice. We'll start with this and then we'll go into the highlights right after. Now we are going to be jumping back in with that 1/2 inch flat-headed brush. We'll grab a very minimal amount, as we tend to do, and I'll start down here because it's a less visually prominent area than up here. We have more room for error, right? It's a good little testing ground. So we'll apply this over quite a bit of our rock. We'll move it up in the canvas, try to randomize it, and I'll have it move downwards on this side. It's all very subtle right now. It's how it's meant to be. It is a good thing. There we go. And I'll move it up all the way to this top portion where we are going to have some roots and different fun applications. I'm also going to move it on top of the open area of canvas, just like we did with this texture. That way it doesn't look like it's awkwardly stopping. And then we'll just move it in a little bit, and at this point this will all be fairly dense foliage, so we really don't have to worry about that. One more little pass through with a bit more thick paint, now that I know that I like it. And we'll move on up to this top area. Almost dip my brush in water. Do not do that with this brush in this process. That will condense the bristles and it'll make it so instead of 100 little taps, you get one. Do be careful with that. You'll obviously have to clean your brush after each session, or not even session, but each step with this, because you don't want the pigment to dry on the brush and actually ruin it. But at that point, you do want to dry it fairly well before you use it again for the next step. Here, covering quite a bit of our rock. I know when I started painting, I'd be very apprehensive to do this because I put all this time and effort into this rock that I really liked, and now I'm covering it up. That's okay. That's just a part of the process. Now we know that the open areas of rock that we do have look fantastic, and they only look that way because we put that effort in. So it's okay that we are losing some of our detail and some of that rock, because what is left there is going to be great. So we'll just apply that, and now we'll head back over to the reference photo and grab our highlight. So now when we head over here and we look at this moss, you can see that it's fairly bright, but it's not as bright or saturated as what we have down here. So we're not going for the brightest of pigments, but we're also not going for the darkest of pigments. Again, it's more of a middle ground, but a middle ground that's a little bit closer to bright. And here, it's a bit brighter and a bit more yellow. We may incorporate some yellow into the piece a little bit later, but let's start with essentially that pigment, and we'll do so by grabbing our sap green, titanium white, and that is far too bright. That might even be similar to that. Yeah, even too bright there. So we'll grab some Mars Black. This is going to really mute it. It's going to desaturate it. It's going to darken it. That looks quite nice there. And it looks actually a little bit too dark for that area. So we'll add more titanium white back in, further desaturating it. And that looks really, really nice. Okay, this is the color we'll go with for up there. And we may, you know what? Yeah, we'll go down here too. That does look nice, especially when you tap it beside these little pieces. I think that fits really well. Now, I think we came to the conclusion that the highlights kind of fit best right up here. They worked quite well down here, but they fit best right up there. So I'm going to grab that pigment. Again, using that scruffy, flat-headed brush. We'll head to the top here. And we'll start working on some of that moss. Working it in between the rocks, and I'm trying to avoid all of the little divots that we created previously. I really love those, and I think that they work really nicely. Here we're creating a fairly sound top. Have it start to roll down the rock here. Dissipate into where we're going to have the foliage. And I'll also have it dissipate as we move over to the left, as that's also going to be more larger foliage. Brighten some of these not super top areas up, but areas that are still pretty close to the top. You will probably have to forego some detail, but again, that is okay. We put it in there so that we had option, and at this point I think set option is telling us to add more moss, even at the cost of some of our rock detail. Though we will still have a lot of beautiful rock detail down here, so it's not like we needed to save it for every portion. Here I'll add some up at the top. Have it dissipate as we move down. Again, we're going to have a lot of foliage through there. So now I think we'll head to the bottom. There we go. And you can even throw a little bit of that mossy highlight down into the rocks, though I don't want to do too much because we have a lot of green and we don't have too much of our blue, right? So we're just going to balance it as best we can. There we go. Okay. Took a couple of steps back, realized that I wanted to make this area a bit more blocky. Go in for one more pass here. One more pass up here. And then we'll switch to a different brush. That being our liner brush. We're going to add a little bit of titanium white to our mixture. Just like that. Generally you don't want to blend with this brush, but we're not doing too much paint and we have a lot pre-mixed, so it won't be too difficult. And now we'll brace our hand using our pinky finger to eliminate shake. And then we can go in and tap all of the minute little details that we want to create very notable form and movement. So here I wanted a less ambiguous break between this area and this area. So I just went in with this little tap and built this up. Now, this is probably quite far away visually for you. However, I don't want to bring you any closer because I think the second you start looking at it very close up is just very risky, and essentially the time where you end up doing too much in one area. So I do recommend painting this from a little bit farther away if you can. Just reach out your arm You'll lose a little bit of control, but that isn't really a bad thing, especially in organic subjects. It's just going to make things have more of a natural flow to them. You can even hold your brush farther back. But here I'm going back and forth trying to further define this top area. And I'll do it over on this side as well. This is because the light is coming down, there's a bit of an opening. It's really going to illuminate this very specific portion. Make it pop in a really nice way. There we go. Light's just subtly working its way down there. Really love it. Go in with a bit of a tap, because I had a lot of strokes and now I want just a mixture of texture. Do a couple down here as well. Trying to spread out these techniques, that way they are cohesive throughout the piece and don't feel too clustered and out of place in one spot. Don't want to do any more there because I do want to keep it a little bit darker, and I may go back and actually darken it later with a wash, but for now I think that looks fine. Just doing a little bit of additional texture. You can see just how these layers add up, make it so much more interesting. There we go. So now we get to dive into a really fun part, which is all of the foliage that we have over on the left and right hand side. However, there's a lot of it and I don't want it to feel overwhelming, so we're actually going to begin over here on the left hand side, focus on that, then move over there. So with this, we're going to start by mixing up a darker green for the base layer, and again, all of this is dry, not too worried about it. Grabbing an equal mixture of our green and our Mars black, grab, maybe 2/10 that in our titanium white. I'm okay if this is a bit more desaturated because realistically we're going to cover all of these applications and I do want it to be brighter than that. So we'll work in a bit more green and a bit more titanium white. Didn't want to just put in the titanium white though because that really would desaturate it, and adding the extra green balances it fairly well. Maybe a bit more Mars black. We're kind of going back and forth until we find a good medium. We'll try that. And again, a bit brighter. Friendly reminder that you don't have to go with the very first mixture you come up with. I think we've gotten quite lucky throughout this a number of times, and that isn't always going to be the case. It's much better to continuously tweak until you have something you genuinely like than just commit to the very first application. That said, we are incredibly close. I think this will probably make it exactly what I want it to be. Yeah, okay, I like that a lot. So, heading over to the canvas. Though, we'll do so with the smaller liner brush. So, as per usual, we begin by making sure that our brush is nice and damp. We'll grab some of this darker mixture, and there's a lot that we can do in here. We're going to be working on numerous pieces of foliage. However, we're going to start all the way closest to the waterfall and work our way this way, again, just to instill a little bit of organization and compartmentalize so things are a bit easier. So, this first application I can tell that's closest to the waterfall is a series of very small little pieces of foliage, probably the smallest that we'll be painting. And I'm not going in with just a dot, I'm going in with a tap and then a little bit of a drag. And you can see that they're quite small, but I'm trying to add some movement so that it drapes down. It looks like there's some weight to it. And you can connect them at the top if you'd like. You can see that we're really taking our time doing a lot of these little guys. I'm going to take a little bit of a break here, and I'm going to start again, a couple of millimeters away. We'll connect this all the way up into the moss so that it looks like it's coming from somewhere, right? Give it good context, make it cohesive with everything else. And we'll continue this down until we get to that area where we have the break. We can't really continue it down here because we don't see anything. It moves inwards, right? Just connect that up again. And I'm leaving different little openings and holes, trying to respect the previous rock guidelines that we created earlier. And now I'll grab more of that pigment. And we'll start on a different type of foliage. This is going to be a bit larger. So I'm going to press harder with my brush. You can see just how big that is. And these are, for the most part, going to be coming down and moving that way. Again, there's this falling motion. This idea that we are slowly moving to the right. I connect a couple of them at the top. They can overlap each other. There we go. I'm going to skip a little bit of our spacing. And we're just trying to build diversity amongst our subjects. Obviously, the technique is very similar between these two applications, but because of the sizing difference and how we're breaking things up, it does give us that needed change. I'll also do a couple going this way just because that would happen. There'd be this common movement, but then there'd also be ones that kind of reject that. Now as we get closer this way, yet again we change our application. And this time, I'm just looking up at the reference photo. We're going to go for an even larger leaf. So this is going to be comprised of 2 strokes on the sides and then one in the middle. And then there's another leaf right beside it. And then we have another one right down here. And you can tell that this looks brighter than this, which looks brighter than this, and that's just the paint drying over time. Generally, paint looks brighter when it's wet, and that's why this is going to be our darker base layer. But it's also reflective when it's wet, right? Which is going to make it look even brighter. Now here again, we'll work on some of these larger leaves. And they connect to a point. There we go. This will look a whole lot better, by the way, when we start working on our really nice highlights. So, fear not. I'm also going to do a different type of leaf where it has all of these little extended pieces. This is actually relatively common in the reference photo. And obviously we can't continue it down on top of this because they're the same pigment and you just won't be able to see it. But when we go back and do our highlights, that's where we can really accentuate that. But this is a, again, relatively common thing in the reference photo, so we can incorporate it a couple of times here. And we can overlap previous subjects with it. because we can bring it out later, again, in the highlight. Though you do want to ensure that when you're doing this, you are, again, a bit more methodical with it. You don't want it to look overly busy. We go for organically messy in a lot of it, but this is something that can very quickly look very messy. So I am trying to be extra careful. And then we have these fun little drapey pieces that come down at the bottom. They're just kind of hanging. And then they expand into little offshoots. I really like this though. It's coming along quite nicely. I'm going to take a step back just so I can see, make sure that we are on track, and I do think we are. So, very, very good. You can also use a smaller liner brush if you feel like the one you have is a little large. I was feeling that a little bit in here. After stepping back, I realized that it is a good size, and I probably shouldn't be making things any smaller right now. But if you do really feel like you want your applications to be a little smaller, a little sharper, you can get a smaller liner brush, or you can cut your current liner brush, something I've done many a time, just to have less bristles. I'm a big advocate of doing what you can with the brushes you have in the moment. I cut a lot of them. I have for years, and I get a lot of questions as to what brush brand I use, things of that nature. And realistically, my brushes are a collection of brushes that I've just collected over the years. I don't really have an affinity for one particular brand, nor do I believe necessarily that one brand is, necessarily great. I avoid getting like truly cheap brushes because you don't want the bristles coming out and kind of getting stuck in your paint and painting. But I mean, if you're spending $10 on a set of 5 brushes, they're going to be fine, and you're probably not going to give you any issues, and that is quite affordable for brushes, considering you can buy individual brushes for $20, $30. So my advice is don't break the bank trying to get acrylic brushes. Artist Loft is a fairly affordable brand. I use, I believe this is one. It is. I use them quite a bit. If you take care of them, they last years, and again, they're incredibly affordable. So don't worry too much about the brushes, and feel free to cut them and change them and do all of that, especially if you need something smaller, or you just want a different shape. Do that with fan brushes as well sometimes if I want really unique looks. There we go. I think as someone who teaches art and painting, I very much like the idea that so much of this is creative and personal, and that we all have our own likings, way of doing things, and there isn't necessarily always a right or wrong, that it's about doing things the way that you like and that you believe in. I'm here to offer ideas and guide you and get you started, but I really do feel like you should feel quite free when creating art, and that you should do so in the manner that you like, even through unconventional means. So do feel free to explore. There we go. I think that looks really natural, which I like. We have a lot of diversity in there. That's good. Moves down into the rocks, kind of drops to a point where it makes sense that it would stop. All of that is fantastic. Okay, now I think what we'll do is we'll grab some of our titanium white, more of our green. We'll just mix up a brighter variant. And I'm not necessarily going to make this one perfectly match the reference photo, because I can see a couple of different hue and value changes that I kind of want to play with myself on the topic of, going our own way with things. But here I'm just mixing something that's a little bit brighter. We'll test it up in the moss to make sure it's not too bright or saturated, and it isn't, so that is fantastic. We can see that the light is coming down on the moss here, so it only makes sense that the foliage that the moss is connected to also receives a similar highlight, and then dissipates as you move farther down because we're moving farther and farther away from that light. Here I'm highlighting a couple of these little pieces that we started with, but not all of them. You can see that it dissipates as we move farther down. And it's all starting to come together. It's taken some time, admittedly, but that isn't a bad thing. Really love what we have here. It's worth noting that I think it's currently 1:30 in the morning. I'm working on this. I'm having a really hard time putting it down. I think I want to finish tonight. I'm feeling energized. I'm feeling excited. I love what we're doing. And while I'm not normally one who likes to stay up too late, sometimes the piece just really gets you, and you find yourself in these situations. So I hope you find yourself equally as inspired and in love with the process. I find that so much of this technique-wise is just so relaxing, but so exciting at the same time. There's a lot of successes, and there's a lot of, again, I use the word a lot because I think it just really explains the feeling of the process, but cathartic. I think that there are just a lot of cathartic applications and processes when doing foliage like this. It's difficult to get it wrong, right? Because it's organic, it's just fun. And I love that. I love when art is that way. Now here I'm getting into the larger pieces of foliage that we crafted. Again, predominantly working on the top ones, but I'm not doing all of them. Only the ones that I think are going to receive the most light, and as I get farther down, you can see that I'm not applying it as much. I'm kind of letting that paint run out on my brush. I'm not hyper interested in making this bottom area pop. There we go. Going to take a couple steps back. Just looked at the camera, we're apparently 13 minutes into this section. But it does take time, and it's not a bad thing. Now, we're going to go over some of these smaller pieces. And this is something that we couldn't do earlier because the colors just meshed too well with the previously applied larger leaf, right? But here's our opportunity to work it over that. So I'm just applying it to the tops of all of these little strands, and then it dissipates and it gets darker as you move towards the bottom. That's how you're really going to make these look 3D and natural. It's a really, really wonderful technique once you kind of nail it. Again, I'm at the point where I'm kind of considering switching to a smaller brush, but it's also working out, so just remember, if you feel like you need it, feel welcome to do that. Just going over our previous applications, making them a little bit brighter, overlapping some of them so that it looks nice and natural. Trying to ensure that each leaf at least has a little bit of something in terms of movement, value change, hue change. It's not just one singular tap. There is always a little bit of a highlight, a little bit of a crease, a little bit of something to make it original and captivating. There we go. And now I'm just going to fill in some of our more open areas with these little taps, different than our actual leaves. So it's this additional application, which is different than everything else. Makes it look nice and full, layered, checking all the boxes. There we go. Again, trying to keep different clusters so we still have that space in between this and this. And this is really something I could spend an hour on, just going back and forth, perfecting, having fun with. Found this little guy down here, thought, you know what, we could definitely add some extra pieces to it, some extra highlights, without making it too bright. But I do want to go back in and add some brightness to this. So, yet again, we grab more titanium white, we go into our mixture, and we brighten. I'm not going to add any more green because I'm okay with it desaturating itself just a little bit. I feel like we're kind of at the height of the saturation that I want. So we'll just add the white for the highlight. And we'll go in and we'll continue to build our volume, our layers. This is going to be reserved predominantly for the top. And because it's so bright, we'll definitely need to rework it into the moss to reestablish what the true height of highlight is in this area. If you see what I mean. And now that we've incorporated it up here through the series of taps, we can reincorporate it down here and have it look more natural. So a little bit more water on my brush. Going in with those taps, which eventually change to our drags. And I lift my brush off at the end, relieving pressure. That way I get a bit of a sharp tail on the end of the stroke. There we go. I love it. We're going to take a step back, just make sure it's progressing the way we want. So far, so good. There we go. And I know that we're quite a ways into the painting now, so for anyone still here, thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for continuing to keep traditional art alive and just paying attention, being a part of the community. I think it's wonderful when people really do dedicate themselves to learning things, and it's not just a quick stop in a video, it's really digesting it and getting as much information out of it as you can. I know I personally learn a lot from things like this, and it's always my goal to make something that's truly valuable, truly informative, truly fun, just a little bit inspiring too, you know? So I hope you feel at least one of those things, and that you're enjoying yourself and your stay here. I would also like to take this time, as we do, to say a big thank you to everybody up over on Patreon who is directly supporting the channel, making these lessons happen. Say it every week, and I'd like to say it more frequently, but big thank you to you. These lessons could not happen without you and your support. It is because of you that I can put the time into these detailed pieces, break them into steps, do the elaborate traceables. All of that, it is all occurring because of you and your support, and I feel incredibly grateful to be able to make art and tutorials for a living, to teach it, to ensure that other people get to also learn this great hobby that I think we all share and love. So thank you for making that happen. Thank you for keeping the lights on, as they say. And again, I know I say it every episode, and I hope it doesn't get boring or that it sounds like lost words. It is something I genuinely very much mean, and I would like you to know every single week, and I would like to just continue to say thank you. So again, big thank you. And to anybody who may be new to the channel, you can also support the channel up over on Patreon. There's a link in the video description. But up there you can get the traceables, you can get the reference photos, so you can color match like I do. Again, the traceables help you with the drawing process. There are gridded versions, a lot of fun things like that. But you can also get access to all of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. Talk about what brushes to use, how to use our water, what glazing is, how to plan our compositions, how to mix our colors, color theory. Really, again, just everything you need to know. That way you can feel comfortable jumping into it. And I also have a bunch of ebooks full of traceables for days where, you want to make something, but you're not quite sure what you want to make, and, maybe you don't want to follow a direct tutorial, maybe you want to do more of your own thing. They're great for those. We also have an exclusive Facebook group where people share their work, and often it's of these lessons, so you can kind of get different ideas, ask for help. I try to jump in there as much as I can. I'm pretty busy, so I'm not always able to, but we have a really supportive, really great community, so you can also check that out. There's a lot between the ebooks, the Facebook, the traceables, the reference photos, bunch of fun stuff. So I do recommend checking that out. And it's also just a great way to say thank you and support the channel. But, please do not ever feel obligated to do that. That is only, again, if you feel like you're in a good position. And, regardless, I'm just very grateful that you're here. You're spending the time. You are a part of the community. So, to everybody, thank you for being here. Regardless of how you support the channel, just being here is supportive, and I appreciate it. You can really see just in the last 5 minutes how that's started to come together. Starting to do lots of just little details overlapping with the highlight. Again, trying to find that balance of naturally messy without having it actually look just like too much or too messy, right? Trying to still keep some of these smaller clusters, these darker areas, showing through. Trying to ensure that this bottom area is still quite a bit darker. There we go. Yeah. Do some little taps there. Not too many. Oh, I love it. So nice to create a piece that's this satisfying to create. Okay. I think I'm very happy with this, and I think we're going to move over onto the right-hand side and kind of do a lot of these techniques so that it feels cohesive, but also change it up a little bit so that it's continuously evolving and feels natural, right? Let's head on over to the right. Now, as we head over to the right-hand side, we are going to switch temporarily to the 1-inch flat-headed brush. That way, we can mix up a nice dark base layer and a rather abundant amount of it, right? Because we do have quite a bit of area to cover, and at this point I think we feel fairly comfortable in mixing a larger amount of paint. We've been at this for quite some time, and this will share the same general hues as what we had over on the left hand side. So we'll do a little test just in the areas that remain a bit darker. I think that this is quite nice with a hint of titanium white. It'll be just what we want. So now I'll clean that brush very quickly. That way it doesn't dry with any of the pigment on it. Then we'll switch to the liner brush, grab that pigment, and we'll head in here. Now, we've already started this bottom area, and I'm going to continue from it because it's pre-established and we already have an idea of what we want. Now, these first applications are going to be, again, a tap and drag effect. They're quite small, and it makes sense that they are smaller, especially down in this area, because it's not really getting that much light, and so the foliage, the greenery, isn't probably going to be able to grow to the same extent as a well-lit area, right? So that's just one fun thing to kind of consider, especially if it's the same type of plant that we have up top. But as we do get higher, I'm going to extend my strokes a little bit more. I'll connect them more, we'll overlap more. Here I'm also leaving little spaces as we do, creating clusters. And we'll leave this opening right here, but we'll connect it right down there. consistently trying to look for easy ways of altering similar applications. Things are getting bigger, moving these strokes off to the left and right, but predominantly, again, I want to move to the left. These moved into the right, these move into the left, they all point, right? We get that really subtle idea of leading lines. There we are. Going back yet again. Create some larger pieces. And then as I get higher up, we'll again leave some space. You can see that I'm starting to hold my brush almost horizontally for some of these. You can have ledges, and these can grow on the ledges, and therefore we have a bit of a harder line, a connecting set of all of our greenery at the top there, rather than it kind of disappearing into a darker spot. It's also something fun we can do. Continuously, again, looking up at the reference photo, but trying to make alterations, trying to make it a little bit different. Now here, I do want one of these fun pieces, as all of those little extending portions. Can do a second one. Add in that diversity. Do another right here. Can kind of get lost behind some of this other foliage. Taking a couple steps back, just making sure. Okay, I think this is a little too solitary. So we'll bring it back down and blend it into here. Not through a conventional blend, but just through a collection of strokes which unify this area with this area. Then we can subtly bring it down into here. Now we have an interesting opening, an opening of a different size and shape, an opening of a different size of shape. Again, another little opening. It's all starting to come together. Go back, grab more. The foliage up here should be quite large, so let's create a couple of leaves through multiple strokes. Up until this point, it's all been a single stroke, and now we have connection. You can see that I'm leaving space so that I have room to kind of figure things out as I go. My brush is fairly watery, so my applications are semi-transparent, but they're all quite sharp. If I really like it, I go over it a second time. That way I know to maybe add some highlight to it. There we go. Again, taking a step back. Grab a bit more of our pigment. Again, I generally don't like to blend with the smaller liner brush, but it's definitely doable. There we go. Now I'm going to take that excess paint off my brush because it would be too much to work with and create very sharp lines. So we lose a little bit of paint because we blended with the brush, but we do get a better application because of it. Here we're creating another little one that kind of breaks apart into pieces. Really like those around the top. You can kind of see all of the detail getting lost at this point. That's okay. That'll come out in the highlights. Here, overlapping. Just building it up. Maybe little taps in between different pieces. And the top has a really neat plant where it's essentially these but connected. Generally like to start with the middle portion, as it acts as the spine, and then we can build out. Lots of these at the top. Okay, now we'll move back into a bit more of the conventional leaf. Don't really have any moss over on this hand side. And we don't really have any of the rock showing. So we're just filling this up with all of our foliage. And there's nothing wrong with that, because it means that this side is going to be different from the left-hand side. Just going in with a little tap, filling in some of the darker areas, and I like that in terms of the general form. So, now we grab some titanium white, make it nice and bright, go into the tops, and if you apply this to an area that is currently wet, it is going to blend, and you're not going to get something as bright as what you have on your palette, but you will get a nice soft transition. And that's kind of what I'm dealing with right now, recognizing that I'll go back in and do another set of highlights in a little bit. And I'm working this predominantly on the left-hand side of our foliage because the light's coming down, right? And predominantly on the top of it, because when it goes down to that bell shape, the bottom tip isn't really going to get as much light. There we go. Very nice. There we are. Starting to come together. You can see how this side is just so much more full in terms of highlight and texture. And that's what we're working towards. Slowly and steadily. There we go. Go back, grab more. You can see just how sharp these applications are because I recently grabbed water. Do some little taps on our moss, brighten that up. And then of course we'll head in here. And I'm not going to highlight all of them. We talked about this on the other side, but you only want to highlight the ones that you think will A, be receiving the most light, and B, you also just don't want to do too many in one area because then it becomes a little repetitive. So we're jumping around a lot. I'm highlighting the left-hand side, but I'm being selective. And we're just building up this massive amount of greenery. Let's go for an even brighter mix now. You can see just how much brighter that side is. That's what we're working towards. And I know these are very long clips, but I really wanted you to retain a lot of this for it to sink in, for it to be memorable, right? Rather than just kind of breezing past it I want it to be something that we talk about a couple of times, that has an opportunity to sink in. I think that's important. I'm a big fan of repetition in learning, in memory. So hopefully the fact that we're actually doing both sides, and we're doing both sides in real time, it really can stick with you. And these are applications and ideas you can bring with you for years to come through a wide variety of pieces. It's always the goal, not to just teach one specific painting, but to teach techniques, why we're doing things, how we're doing things. That way you can incorporate them into your own paintings. There we go. Remember, we're not highlighting the entirety of the spines, just little portions of them here and there. And you can tell that this one looks like there's this gradual movement up it, where this one looks like there's this larger rock that everything's kind of moving on top of, and then there's another dip down. They're both quite different, just in terms of their general shape, and I think that's very much aiding the piece. By looking at one side, you don't understand the other. You have to look at the other, you have to consider it. You have to digest all of it. Taking a couple steps back. Yeah, that's really nice. I do want more of a highlight on this area because I feel like that's important. I feel like it highlights the transition, the movement of this larger area. So we just take more titanium white, go in with a bit of a tap, get that top edge, work our way in a little bit, and then we can work that into some of our foliage, just so it's as natural as can be. There we go. Again, just putting it in the middle of the spine, not the entirety of it, and not all of the offshoots. If we really highlight this area, we can make it look like it's popping out to a greater degree too. There we go. Yeah, really neat. This is a lot of fun. Okay, taking a step back, just kind of internalizing. I think I want to continue the darker green up a little bit. That way there's more of a natural transition between this and this. Because right now it looks like there's a very steep climb right here. It looks like it's moving up and then directly up. And I want it to be slightly more subtle. And by creating more of a transition there, we can make it look a bit more rounded rather than a direct, steep transition. So we'll just go in with a bit of a tap. That's definitely softening it. There we go. It's amazing what just a little bit of intentional application can do. And by creating this line, it looks like there's, again, more of that gradual move. We can even transition a higher point in it to do that as well. Watch this. Okay, now we have this larger slope. And now it feels like just this area is really built up and out. And we can continue to change that by continuing to put in these more notable diagonal pieces. Though, again, I don't want it to look as flat as this side. So I'm not going to do it to an extremely grand extent. You can see though that the more we connect these pieces of foliage and greenery, the more it does feel like a movement rather than a hard line. And that's definitely the goal. Okay, I like that a lot. I really, really like what we did there. I think we can do slightly more of a highlight, and then we'll be done with this portion. For now. We might go back to it later. We might do more highlights, but for now I think this is really well balanced with the other side. It's different. It's what I want it to be. And again, it's deviating a fair amount from the reference photo, but artistic liberties are fun. There we go. I guess one thing that I don't like about it, to be honest, is how there's almost a hard line of greenery, right? We don't stop and start again. That's an issue. Let's fix that. Let's fix that together. Grab some more of our sap green. Let's highlight that moss. Let's highlight this moss. Do you remember how forever ago I did a little bit of a tap of green into here as well? Well, it's paying off. And this can kind of come up and connect, because now we have this area that kind of moves down in a neat way. It's important to be honest with yourself. While I really loved the technique and the movement, when I did step back I realized that it was just too much of a simple shape. There weren't enough anomalies, broken off pieces, and those definitely helped it greatly. Okay, much happier with that. And to finish it off, we'll grab more of our Mars Black, more of our Sap Green, so we have something closer to our original color. And we can just work in, or rework, some openings to just break up that harder line. There we go. I think our next step is going to be moving some of the trees that we have up here down into these areas. So we'll grab some Mars Black, grab a little bit of titanium white, grab this tree, and we'll just move it right down into here. This one can also be moved down. Create another one that'll kind of crisscross a little bit. This is just going to create more depth. It'll tie the background, the midground, into the foreground. Something we are consistently attempting to do. And we have all of these different subjects that these trees can get lost in, which is really nice. I'm not doing too many, but I'm doing enough to highlight the depth. And I'll even go ahead and do that on this side as well. There we are. Now I think we need a little bit of burnt umber. We'll test on our reference photo, and we'll proceed. So now we're just heading back over to our reference photo to make sure that these browns that we have are correct. I'll grab some of our burnt umber, grab some of our titanium white, that should make something nice and bright. Then, of course, we'll darken it with that Mars black. It turns into a good gray, and a little more saturation back in. And we'll go for a test. This is definitely... It's it's too bright to be our dark pigment, and it's too dark to be our bright pigment. So, we'll start by making the darker one. Some of that Mars black, burnt umber. There we go, found that. And now we'll go for the brighter variant. A lot more of the burnt umber, titanium white. And I think we need more saturation. I think we need more brightness. So we're just slowly moving away from the Mars black in this. It's close. It's not quite there. Again, we'll go more saturated and brighter. Just looking for that consistent progression, and that right there is really nice. So here we have our two colors, and we'll head back into the canvas. So now we're going to take that darker pigment, and we'll just work it along the edge of our newly applied little trees in here. Little branches, things that again are going to be dictated by the light. All of these highlights are going on the left hand side here. Just working that right down into the rest of our foliage, dodging a lot of the greenery. I think that looks quite good. Take the darker pigment off of our brush, grab that lighter pigment, and we'll just work that down in here. Again, left hand side. We'll have it dissipate as it moves down because the light won't be able to follow it to that extent. And the same goes for this, we'll just let it dissipate on our brush and slowly run out. There we go. Nice and easy little applications, but I do think it adds a lot. With that, we are now going to quickly jump over here, do the same. There aren't too many, though you are welcome to really expand on them if it's a feature you very much enjoy. Again, so much of this is subjective, and you work on what you would like to. But with that, I'm very happy with that amount, and we're now going to start working on the waterfall. We're going to go back into a blue, so I would recommend cleaning your water and your brushes quite thoroughly. That way we don't have any green kind of working its way into that. We do want it to be a much more gray, much more neutral with a little bit of blue. So again, let's just make sure everything's nice and clean, and then we'll jump right into there. So now we're going to switch to our 1/2 inch flat-headed brush and create the base layer for all of our water right here. The majority of it is going to be a titanium white, which will just move off to the side right here. We'll grab the smallest hint of Mars black. You can see it really is just maybe 1/20th of our mixture. And then we'll grab the same amount of our ultramarine blue. And as you can see, it's a rather light pigment, but it's not as light as we're going to go. I think we'll just make it slightly darker. Just slightly. Yeah. Slightly more blue. So we ended up with about 1/10 blue, 1/10 Mars black. I like that a lot. Let's head on over to the canvas. So now heading on over to the canvas, this next step is going to be fairly easy. We're not really going for any of those extra details just yet, any of the fancy water techniques. We are just going in here, creating a fairly sharp line, initially of falling water, over on the sides of all of our previous applications. We want it to be nice and thick, so if you feel like you really have to stretch that paint, then just go back to your palette and grab more. Here I'm using the full body of my brush to get in that larger area. However, I do like to start on the sides because that's when we have the most control, the easiest time rendering a very sharp application. That's exactly what we're doing here initially. And then once I have that done, I start to work into the body where I just lose that control as I run out of paint, and I don't have to worry about it too much because it's not a hyper detailed area anyway. Not something that's really demanding of a lot of precision, right? Now we do need more pigment, so we'll remix that up. Titanium white, ultramarine blue, Mars black. Mix it right on top / beside our initial mixture, leaving some of our first attempt right there, just so I know that we are creating the same color. And I think we got pretty lucky. Have to love when that happens. Again, we've been painting for quite some time, so these things should start resonating and be easier to accomplish, be quicker to accomplish, but it's still nice to see that it's actually happening. Heading over to this side, fill in this, go back over the top again. We do want to do multiple layers. Make sure it is nice and thick. Don't want that canvas showing through. As we talked about at the start of the lesson, that is one of those things that is very telling generally of where somebody is and their painting endeavors and their painting journey. Take off a bit of the excess just because it's a little difficult to get into the smaller areas with that much paint on the brush. So we'll go back and we'll grab more. After taking off the majority of it, this time we have less, and therefore we can go in and be more controlled. There we go. Very nice. Very, very nice. Okay, now we'll grab more. We'll find the areas that have started to dry. We'll do a second application. And soon we'll go in with the nice details. But, much like everything else, we do need that base first. There we go. Now that it's fully dry, we're going to head back to our palette, grab more titanium white, more of our blue, and mix up something that's a little bit brighter and a little bit more saturated. A nice highlight for our waterfall. However, this brush right here, it's far too large to render the detail we need. So once it's mixed up, we are going to switch back to our liner brush, which I very luckily have right here. So we'll grab this pigment, we're going to go to the edge of our waterfall, and we're going to create a lot of splashing motions. We're going to imagine that the water skipping over itself, so we'll have a little piece that goes up, comes back down, goes back out. We'll have little pieces that just go out. And then we'll move this on to the inside as well. We're going to want to create a lot of movement. We can go outside of the lines and create falling water that does connect occasionally, but also doesn't in other areas. Though it's very important that you do remember to move back inside this area, because we don't want it to look like the edges are roughly outlined, right? There we go. And we're doing this because the edges are going to be less thick. There's a less volume, there's not as much water on the sides, therefore it's more semi-transparent, therefore there are openings, and therefore we have these very notable movements where When you get more into the middle, that isn't really the case because the water is much more dense. There's more water there. Though we are going to go in with that same technique, leaving smaller portions of that gray visible. I'm going to go over the edges a couple of times to build up that pigment because our brush is fairly watery. It is semi-transparent, and we might still see that hard line from the initial gray in that area. So we just want to ensure that we don't have to worry about that. There we go. Put that brush down, go back to our larger one. I'm now very confident in our mixture, so we can mix significantly more of it than we did initially. Again, mixing on top, leaving little portions on the side just to ensure that I do remix correctly. I have a lot of titanium white in this. There we go. It's quite close, but we're going to go back and forth. That way we can, again, mix a real abundance. Now we'll clean off that brush so that it doesn't dry with all of that pigment. Grab our smaller liner brush as we do, and head back. Now I'm going to go over these edges a number of times, as I mentioned, but slowly just building that up. There we are. May look a little unnatural with just this area done, but once we start moving around, getting the middle portion, it'll all start to fit together and look a lot more natural. Here I'm going for a bit of a tap and a drag. Grab more paint. The top will be the brightest, by the way. It'll be the most dense, and then it'll separate more so as we get down towards the bottom. So you can do more layering at the top, as you don't have to worry about so much of the gray showing through. But as we get down towards the bottom here, that is an area where we need to be a little more cognizant of leaving those openings and that contrast. There we are. Certainly getting there. Will take a little bit of time, and it is our first area like this, so we are still just getting those techniques down. Don't have to blaze through it. Again, nothing wrong with taking your time in a painting. Making something you're really proud of, right? That said, despite us still being in one of those awkward phases, I think this side is starting to look a whole lot better than that side. Wouldn't you agree? We're going to continue getting those edges. There we go. And if you find you make any of this too consistently bright, then you can always go back in with the initial color and work in little spots. Here you can see I'm occasionally overlapping the darker middle pieces we incorporated, but they definitely do add a lot. They add some depth, that protruding rock that the water has to work around definitely gives us more dimension. Now we find ourselves at another edge, which is fun. Real place to elaborate visually. We'll have the water just falling right there. And I am going to have to remix even more paint. Saw how much we did, but despite it being a smaller area, we are doing a lot of layering. And we do want quite a bit of this to be fairly thick. So we will be using a lot of paint. Get to move over here, which is quite fun. Just continue to work to that left. Add more and more. Again, the top has more strokes. It's brighter, has more light, the water is more condensed. Number of factors going into making that area the standout. Going to have some fun on the edge first, just to kind of figure out how much detail I want. Have a lot of free falling water right here that I don't necessarily want to connect to anything. There we go. Again, this is more falling almost straight, so I'm going to have all of these little pieces, all these little droplets on the outskirts that do not move back inwards. These are kind of hitting other portions of rock and finding their way out. Really love adding in the brighter highlight portions. Makes such a difference. That said, we can't forget about this side. So just go in, some taps. See, there's a nice little crossover there. I like that a lot. Again, more of that water that's really just falling after hitting other rock. Definitely getting there. Not quite, but we are getting there. Going to add some extra highlights here. And you generally want these to be brighter at the bottom, and then they work their way up and dissipate. We're not going to have as much of it at the top because it just hasn't had that much space to kind of accumulate and fall. Really fun process. Okay, I'm going to take a couple of steps back. So far, so good. So far, I like it. So far, I like it a lot. I think we'll switch back to our other brush, though, and do a bit more mixing. Just ensure that we have nice, thick layers. And you can even make it a little bit brighter as you progressively go. Make it pop more, add those extra levels of depth. It isn't necessary, but it is something you are welcome to do. That can aid the piece. Again, we want these edges to be really nice and detailed, ever evolving. Water's falling, splashing. There's a lot happening. There we go. Water falling over there. We have this nice large gap that creates a lot of contrast because it's just so dark. See that I'm starting to connect a couple of pieces, but not all of them. Have it all lead back up. do that over on the other side as well. Again, we want the bottom part to be the most thick, the most bright, and then it tailors upwards. Yeah. Very good. Very, very good. Okay. Now, the next technique is going to be working almost reductively, in that we're going to take water away. We're going to grab some of that Mars Black, a little bit of our blue, smallest hint of our titanium white. We're remixing the color that we used for the base. Just like that. I'm going to make my brush a bit more watery. And now, we add in more rock around our waterfall. So we can further separate things or create little nooks and crannies that the water kind of is missing or is working around. Again, not something you have to do, but if you want to go that extra mile, add the extra detail. It is an option. And I quite like just having the extra control and ability. Again, that's really what acrylic painting is. It's the opportunity to re-alter things time and time again until you get them exactly how you want them to be. There we go. Lots of concentration right now. Really focusing on just all of the areas I want to open up. All of the areas that I want to keep a bit more structured. And retain their initial application and form, right? We can try things, maybe cut that one off. Maybe we like it, maybe we don't. That said, we've been working at this for a while and I've been very close to the canvas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a 3-minute break. I'm going to step away from the canvas, really examine it from a distance, and then come back and kind of alter as need be. Now, I actually decided to do a little bit of it off camera just to test some different techniques and figure out what exactly I wanted this to turn into and how we would get it there. Now, while I was doing all of those applications that you saw, I kept reducing space in here to make that a little bit more wide, but then I felt like it just lacked so much detail and the rest of the piece is full of it. So what I decided to do was incorporate a technique that we do in a lot of our space scenes. It's something that I personally love. I think it's really fun. It adds a lot of detail very quickly and very sporadically, which I think is great for falling water. And so we'll do that. Now, I take my liner brush, I take my titanium white, a little bit of our blue, a little bit more maybe, and then we grab a lot of water and we add said water to our palette, and then I go back and I grab more water and I add that to our palette, and then I put the palette down. If you've watched the channel before, you know exactly what I'm going to do. I put the brush fairly close to the canvas on the same angle that I want there to be paint. I peel back the bristles and I just launch all of these little applications down here, and this is the level of detail that I was looking for, but I was having a hard time achieving with the smaller brush because the canvas just isn't that large and the amount of detail that I wanted was very just very much, right? We're in the foreground now, so detail should be very abundant, And sometimes just using the brush naturally through a brush stroke isn't going to get you where you want to be. So here, we're just incorporating a different technique. And I'm just pushing some paint towards that canvas. There are going to be areas here where you get a little bit of it just kind of where you don't want it, and in those scenarios you can kind of go back in with the previous color that you were working with. But I really think this is a great technique for falling water, especially on such a small canvas. Really makes it feel like it's crashing and getting into all of these other spaces. You can see that I'm doing it more than once. I'm really taking my time, building it up. And it's going to create little lanes sometimes. It's not always going to come out as a splatter, which is nice because then it's, again, just a natural organic pathway. Here I'll take some of that paint, and we've started to create some lines through here, and I can just follow them and expand upon the waterfall in a very, very fun way. Way I wouldn't have thought to. There we go. Lanes that were not there before, nor would they have been. So now, I just go back in, and I don't want to overdo it. Certainly going to stop soon, but we'll just make sure that we have a nice amount. And with that, we can take our Mars black, a little bit of that titanium white, a little bit of that ultramarine blue, mix that up. And then if you feel like, again, you've done too much, or you took away a lot of contrast, we can just work that darker pigment back over different portions and even it all out. I accidentally put it over some of our rock over here, and I just want to redefine these areas, so going in with that dark pigment and just kind of reclaiming that. But really, really nice. I like that a lot. Now going to clean my brush quite well. Grab more of that titanium white. Just the smallest hint of blue. We're going to mix the brightest pigment yet. We'll head into the top of our waterfall. Both sides. Do some additional taps. And we'll just have that falling through the middle to finish it off. Give it that extra little bit of depth. And I love it. There we go. Really wonderful. Okay, from there, now we get to work on all of the water right down here, though we definitely want to head over to the reference photo for that. Now we get to work on a very large, fun blend, and that is down here in the water. If we look to the base layer, because again, we're going to build this up, we don't want to work on the white-ish highlights, we don't want to work on the mid values in here just yet, we want to work on the darker bottom portion. And right here, that is a bit more of a blue, it changes into a bit of a green right here, it's safe to assume that continues into there, but then it transitions into a very bright brown. And over here is more of a black. Here is more of a blue. So we need essentially a strip of our ultramarine blue, very dark, and then it transitions into a bit of green, and then that transitions into a bit of our brown. So a lot of transitions. We'll start with the 1-inch flat-headed brush because we want a lot of pigment, and we'll begin with mixing our blue. Again, we don't want too much titanium white in there because we don't want it to be too bright, but I am going to grab some to desaturate it. And we'll mix up a nice dark blue here. Just like that. That right there is really pretty. Okay, let's give that a little test. Love it. Now we move into the green, and I'll continue using this pigment just because it's going to blend into this, so it's a very natural progression. I think this is going to be far too bright. Yeah, okay, so we can just darken it with more Mars Black. You can see them right next to each other on the palette. That's nice. I think we need a bit more of the green saturation. And that'll work nicely. Then it transitions into something darker. We can mix that a little bit later. And then finally we need our brown, which will transition into the green. So again, I don't have to clean my brush. Grab that burnt umber. Just continue brightening. You can see it gets really quite bright. Though I do think I'm going to keep more green in mine, just because I really like that natural movement from color to color. Give that a test. I think it'll be darker. Yes, much, much darker. Okay. Slowly building it up. Though I don't really want it to compete with the whiter highlights, so I think that's probably as bright as we'll get. Yeah, okay, very happy with that. Again, it's a little different, but it's what I want. Artistic liberties. Let's head over to the canvas, start applying all of these pigments. Now, our brush already has that brown on it, so we might as well begin there. And I'll apply that right towards the left-hand side. Doesn't quite go towards the bottom because there's a drop-off. This is essentially a rock which is almost protruding from the water, but not quite, so you're catching that warmer light. Just like that. Now I'm going to clean my brush relatively well. It doesn't have to be perfect because we are just transitioning colors. We'll grab some of our green and we'll blend that like so. I think we'll also have to mix a bit more of it because in the time it took to mix the brown, this did start to dry, and that is a-okay. Just make that a bit darker, and I think we found our pigment. So yeah, that looks great. We'll continue through here. Now we move up. We transition to our blue, which has also started to dry. But we've been painting for quite a while, and we can refine those colors. That said, if it does dry, and you just can't quite keep up, don't worry about it. You can always paint wet into dry, which is where you just make your brush a little bit more damp, and you allow the new wet layer to transparently move over the dry layer, slowly revealing more and therefore creating a gradient. But here we're doing this wet into wet. So far so good. Really love these colors. We've been doing greens and blues and grays, but we haven't been combining them, we haven't been blending them, and this is a nice opportunity to do exactly that. Here we're just moving it up into the rocky color that we have. Do think I want my blue to be a bit darker at the top though. So I'll grab more Mars Black. Through there, there's a bit of an arch in the reference photo that I'm incorporating. So it isn't a perfectly straight line, there's a bit of a movement, but when we incorporate all of this splashing, a lot of that will be lost anyway. I'm also now going to grab the Mars Black, incorporate it with our green, create the darkest mixture thus far. Apply this right down here at the front. We'll create not a soft blend, but a harder line, separating the brown, which is again a rock kind of a bit higher up, and this is the shelf where it drops off. Gets darker, but it will blend softly over into the green. There we go. And this area will be a bit of a mix. Nice, subtle, dark colors. Like that a lot. Though, our next layer will need to be applied when it's all fully dry. So, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my smaller liner brush, grab some of our brown, and if it's fully dry, again, just mix up a little bit more of it. And I'm going to create a little bit of texture in our rock by just adding in some little lines. This is areas that are protruding, but also little divots where it gets darker at the bottom. This is just going to give us some extra detail in the foreground, something we do want to incorporate more and more so, because remember, foreground often has more innate coloring, often has a higher contrast, often has more saturation. So we are just building up this foreground, making all of these horizontal lines that move up and down at the ends and sometimes connecting them. That way it does look like one cohesive rock. And we'll let our paint run out as we move towards the back and towards the right hand side, just having it naturally dissipate. There we go. A lot of this will be covered up by the waves and moving water, but it's a nice detail to have. And we can also make a slightly darker variant and have it just kind of move down. That way we can recognize that there is a bit of a shelf happening here. There we are. Okay. Like that a lot. Not too detailed, but not too simple. If anything, we'll add slightly more of a highlight. And then once this is done, we'll take a 5-minute break, let everything dry, and come back in with our waves. Now we're going to switch to this 1/2 inch flat-headed brush that we've been using, and we're going to start working on the mid value. We just finished the darker base layer, now we move to the mid, and then we'll eventually move to the highlight. But this right here is a greenish blue. It's very desaturated, so we'll grab quite a bit of our titanium white. We'll grab some of our ultramarine blue, about an equal mixture of our sap green, mix that together, and it's certainly far too bright and too saturated. So now we'll grab some Mars Black, mix that together, and now we have something a bit darker, a bit more desaturated. We'll give it a test. I think it'll be too dark. It is far too dark. So we'll grab more titanium white, just do a little course correction, say, okay, you know what, if it's too dark, we'll just make it brighter, and we'll see how this works. Might need more saturation, might not. And that right there looks really close. With just some extra titanium white, I think we'll be where we want to. A little bit more. Getting a good, healthy mix. That way some areas aren't brighter, some areas aren't darker. There we go. Okay, perfect. We'll head back in with this and start building up those layers. So now we're going to go in with a bit of a damp brush, grab that brand new pigment, and we are going to incorporate a little bit of movement in our water. So I'm going to start with an application like that, and then move down. And you can see we have this wave-like effect. And I'm just going to grab it and I'm going to keep moving it in the center here for a little while. We'll move it back. Going to grab more water. You can tell that it was starting to get a little bit difficult to move, and whenever that happens, we just need to ensure that we keep that paint a little bit more thin. It means that it will be semi-transparent, but that really isn't an issue. We're not going to move it too far back, but we will do a little bit of a tap as we approach the blue line that we have. That's because generally in the foreground you have a lot more visual movement with waves, and the farther back you get, the more it turns into a horizontal application. We'll work a little bit of it up into the brown rock, but not too much. The water is covering it, but not to a great extent, right? There we go. And now we also have a little bit over here to the right hand side. Then we have some taps in the back. You can even work the line for the water working around the rock. However, all of this is going to have a lot of splashing from that eventually, so we'll probably visually lose quite a bit of it. That isn't an issue though. Again, it's one of those things where you paint in the detail just in case it shows, but you don't really count on it showing, and you're okay with covering it up. Okay, it looks a little bit messy, to be fair. However, this is what it should look like. And it's the layers that we apply after which will make it look good. So, once again, just trust that process, and we will bring this to something that looks pretty beautiful. With that, in the process of adding it, I realized that the brown really does need to be brighter. So, we'll just do that now. Grab some burnt umber, titanium white. You can see the previous mixture right beside it. This is much, much brighter. Working that edge. I'll move it back. Skipping spots. There we go. It actually balances all of it a lot better because now this looks a little bit darker in comparison. I like that a lot. Very good. And then again, we can just create some little shelf life pieces. Show that it's moving down. A little bit of finger painting. We haven't done that much in this lesson. That's something I do quite a lot in painting, actually. Funny that it hasn't come up. But so far so good. Really like it. We are going to head now, yet again, back to the reference photo. So now that we have those mid values incorporated, we're going to start working on the highlights, and you can see that there are just a litany of little taps throughout here, and they even outline some of the waves, just, you know, those higher areas that catch more light. Now, this is really bright. I think it really should be an extension of the highlight pigment that we have there. So it's a lot of our titanium white, and then a very small amount of our ultramarine blue. We'll just mix that up. Brighten it. Brighten it. Brighten it. Do a little test, and that's perfect. So we'll just work this throughout quite a large space, but in very minimal strokes, and we will switch our brush to do so. So now we're heading back in, probably expectedly, with the liner brush. We'll grab some of that pigment, and I'm going to begin over here because it is an important spot. We're going to find the tops of some of these waves, just do little taps, and we're not outlining the top, we're just doing a lot of little movements around that area. They're slightly separated. And these aren't perfectly horizontal lines. A lot of them are arced, where there's slightly more pressure applied in the middle. That way it's larger, and then the ends, there isn't much pressure, so it's a bit more tapered. As you can see, we are just going in and doing these little tap and drags. They'll get smaller as you move farther and farther away from the foreground, where we are. Trying to create little clusters here and there, but not get repetitive at any point. I'm going to grab a bit more water. And again, in the foreground they can get a bit bigger, like you see there. Work their way up previously incorporated waves and also kind of come off them. This is the shine of the water that's being raised, that's catching more light. And you can even show waterways with it, right? There's a lot you can do. That said, we are going to go over the tops yet again of these brighter spots, as they do imply raised water. Bit of reflection. There we go. I think I need more of it over here, but I'm going to be a bit more apprehensive and not really do too much on this side until we are more solidified in the middle. Now, we're going to continue working the top areas. However, this area is going to become very bright very quickly. I'm going to start filling it in with more of these strokes. Much more so in the body of that very light green. There's a lot of light reflecting in this spot. It's right below the opening in the trees that we have up top. And that's generating just all of this shimmer. Really, really fun to paint. Again, I keep talking about different portions of the painting that I could paint for hours, and I think this lesson's going to be quite long, so it speaks to that fact. But again, I was really inspired. I wanted to get it right. I wanted to show you us getting it right, and that meant breaking it down into a lot of little steps and building it up. I think it's really paying off. Hope that you are finding yourself very inspired, having a lot of fun, learning a lot, accomplishing a lot. Such a rewarding piece, I find. Really glad we did this. The last one on the channel was a sailboat. It was a really warm scene, and it was summery, and it wasn't as detailed as our normal ones, and I wanted to come back with something that you could really sink your teeth into, detail-wise. I think we definitely found the right answer. Continuously grabbing more. You've probably seen me go back to my palette 10 times by now in this process, and it's just so useful, so pivotal. Continuously grabbing more water as well, because I do want all of these applications to be sharp, and if we don't use that water, we'll probably get a much more toothy texture and aesthetic that we don't really want. There we go. It's starting to come together, but it's going to continue to look awkward until we do this back area. And while we're not done with the true foreground here, I think we're going to take a bit of a break from it so that we can work on this spot. That way this will look a little bit less strange as we bring it to fruition. And I say that, of course I say that, and I continue working on it. Again, it's fun, it's hard to stop. But the next process is also going to be fun. So, we're going to leave that for now. We'll grab that nice bluish white. We'll follow some of this falling water till we get to this horizon point, essentially. And then we start that nice splash effect. It's going to go to the left and the right of all of the spots where it makes that impact. And then it's going to make a little bit of a movement forward. So example, going to the left, going forward a little bit, working its way into the water, as you can see. And then we go for just so many little taps, creating all of that buildup. And because it's moving about the way it is, we are going to connect them all at the bottom. And then this is, of course, going to find itself moving forward a little bit. There we go. Work it back up. We'll definitely need to go back in with that splashing effect that we talked about earlier, because that would look really pretty right down here. There we go. Nice splashes. Okay. Now we'll grab that pigment, we'll add water, we'll grab that pigment, we'll add water, set down the easel, line the brush up with the bottom portion, and we'll just fling a lot of paint at the canvas. If you have your computer behind the painting, because you have the reference photo up or something of that nature, do be careful. I know that I have covered my laptop in acrylic paint far too many times because of this technique, and it's just something to be aware of, as your surroundings will be affected. Certainly. You'll see it on the palette when I pick it back up. So we're just going ahead and adding all of that nice splash. I think it's really doing this area a lot of justice. There we go. We'll also do a bit of that splash here in the foreground water, because different portions of this will be jumping up and spraying a little bit. Again, we're not done it, but I think it's a good step to incorporate. There we go. So far, so good. Pick back up that palette. And we'll just go back to creating all of those nice little highlights in here. So many tiny little taps, tiny little highlights that amalgamate to make a full piece. That said, I do think we will go back and clean up a little bit of it, because it did get a little excessive. Not that that's a bad thing. I think that it needed to get that excessive to get the look that I wanted. in a lot of it, but I also feel like some areas got too much, which is natural in such a technique that there's only so much control to it. You can change the general direction by rotating your hand. You can change how large the applications are by how much water you're incorporating, how much paint, the ratios there. But it's still going to have quite the random element to it. That's important to recognize and work with. Grab a bit more of that paint. Okay. Going to now grab the 1/2" flat-headed brush. Grab some of our blue, Mars black, a little bit of titanium white. Mix up something quite similar to what we had in the background here. And we'll just add a little bit of distance. That's essentially what we're doing. Because now the splash doesn't reach close to us. Kind of stops a bit farther away. There we go. Okay, taking a step back. I think it's definitely moving in the correct direction. Really having a lot of fun here. Also, fun update. If I'm getting a little bit quiet, it is now 6:30 in the morning. I believe the last update I had for you was 1 or so, and I just haven't stopped working on the lesson. It's been a real joy, and I'm getting a little sleepy, but I really want to finish. I'm invested, I'm excited, and I'm more of those things than I am tired. So, we'll just continue cleaning that up a little bit. So far, so good. I think that blue being more noticeable is a nice touch in what we're doing. And I think we can break up little portions of this with more of that bluish green. So let's grab some of that blue, hint of green, more Mars black, and of course more titanium white. Start to break it up a bit, weaving in between previous applications. There's a lot of weaving in this. Not just this application, but so many of them. Even back in the waterfall. Okay. So far, so good. Just work that through there. Getting a lot of blue on this side now, which I actually like a lot. I think that paired with this is quite nice. It's almost an orange, right? It's a bit warmer compared to anything else we have, and blue and orange are complementary colors. They help each other pop. I think that the ambiguity of the burnt umber does work really well with the ultramarine blue in such a green piece. So that's great. Grab a bit more. Break up that a little bit. There we go. There we go. Okay. Now, I think we'll just do another small application. Then I'm going to take a couple of steps back and see what we need to do from here. So after taking a couple of steps back, I realized that I wanted more small highlights in this rather than larger accumulated ones. So I'm going to take some of that titanium white, a little bit of our blue, mix those two up together using, again, that small liner brush. And I want to show you this from a real distance because it's so subtle, but it's small little taps with maybe a little bit of a drag, as opposed to going in with a full motion and one that kind of connects different pieces together. We're connecting, but we're doing it through small applications that don't actually touch. It's again, like creating a gradient that isn't actually a change from one hue or value to another, but rather a pattern that gradually changes over time, altering the aesthetic. And it can be of the hue of the or the value, but it's not connected. It's not together, it's not soft, it's not blended. And this is very similar. It's just lots of little taps, occasionally a little drag. I'm going to take a step back. Yeah, okay. So you have the light coming down, it's reflecting, it's brighter. It's definitely the route we want to take. And you see me sometimes in painting, go up, find the light in the sky or the reflection, then I move directly down. That way I know I'm in the right spot, because I think when a lot of us start painting, we can kind of get ahead of ourselves, and then the reflection ends up a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, and it's just not where we want it to be in the end. So, little mental cues can help. Little physical cues. There we go. Might even go back in here, just do a little bit more of a tap, a little bit more of a touch-up. I do like that. And I think we'll also use this pigment on this side to just balance it out a little bit more. There we go. I think that worked quite well. Yeah. Every time I step back, I see something else I want to adjust minorly. And it all adds up. Okay, now we're going to have some fun. Final step, touch-ups. I'm going to take some of our primary yellow. Very first time in the lesson, right? We'll move that over to a different area of our palette. Make this very simple. We'll use an equal amount of titanium white, an equal amount of sap green, and about 1/10 that Mars black. And this is going to give us a brand new yellow that we can incorporate to make these a little bit more interesting, a little bit more vibrant. I didn't initially go for anything that was dramatically different. You can if you'd like. But just moving in this extra color can have a really big impact if you want it to. Here we'll brighten it with some extra titanium white. And from a distance you should even be able to see just what an impact that makes highlighting wise. It's really outstanding. Definitely makes it pop to a greater degree, which can be nice. Again, it's something to be careful with because it really can heighten elements, but provided you don't just kind of rush into it and apply it everywhere, it can be a nice touch to continue building depth, continue adding highlight, working on those values. It's a great tool. We can also use it and the ultramarine blue. Again, we'll go with an equal mixture. Then I will add more of that yellow, titanium white, and we can have a different green than we've used throughout the entirety of the painting. Right? We've been working with the sap green, but we can make a green with the yellow and the blue. And this is something that you can also work in just to create some extra diversity, which is something I definitely want amongst our greens. So we'll just add these to a couple of places on both sides. It's a nice subtle pop that I don't think you initially notice is a different green unless you're actually painting it. But it definitely helps. Definitely adds to the piece. But with that, while I add this is a very long lesson. I'd like to say a big thank you to you for watching. I'd like to say a big thank you to you for being a part of the community. I love that there are people out there that are willing to put this much time and thought into achieving something, into getting better at their craft, into, again, continuing with traditional art. You are those people, and I very much appreciate you and the fact that you're here with me today. So thank you, big thank you. I get the analytics for these, and often I believe it's only between 8 and 14% of people that make it to the very end. So again, if you are one of those people, congratulations. We generally do a little keyword at the end that you can use in the comments to note that you made it this far. I think with the length of this one, that's quite an accomplishment. And what term do we want to use today? I think there are a lot of different things that come to mind with such a lengthy piece. But let's go with journey. I think we went for a journey together with this one. So you can incorporate that in a sentence, you can just say it. But it'll be a little way to note that you made it this far. A little badge of honor. Other people who made it this far will also read it and know. I always find it fun to see who has made it repeatedly throughout multiple lessons. And again, this one, this one's a big one. I'd also, again, like to say a big thank you to our Patreon supporters, Patreon producers, all of the incredible people that make these happen. Thank you. Put a lot of time into this, into the reference photo, and just the traceable. There was a lot to do here, and you allowed that to happen. So thank you to anybody who is new and who made it this far. Again, if you enjoyed, if you'd just like to say thank you, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so up over on Patreon, where you can also get the traceables, the reference photos, access to all of my ebooks, access to our exclusive Facebook group where we share our artwork and talk about what we're doing, how we can improve, what we really like. It's just a very supportive, friendly community. And again, all of the ebooks as well. So I do recommend checking that out. There's a link in the description. But this is a real pleasure. I'm just going in, adding different greens, diversifying, having fun with that. But that's really the lesson. And it's going to be hard to stop. It's going to be hard to kind of say goodbye to this one, to say we're done. Just because it has been such a journey. Really, really had a lot of fun. But we have more paintings to paint. So we do need to conclude it at some point. And I think that we have everything we need and arguably more in here. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of the community. I hope you have a wonderful time. I hope you were inspired, and I will see you soon. So, above all, as always, stay creative.